Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories podcast. I am your host, John DeLynn. It is October 26th, 2021, and I am very, very excited for today's episode, as I always am. Today, we are going to be covering Rodney Meldrum's Book of Mormon Heartland Model, and we are super excited to have back with us on the program Dr. Simon Southerton, and of course, my frequent co-host and dear friend, Gerardo Sumano. Hey, gentlemen, welcome to the podcast. And Simon, it's so great to have you back.
Thanks, John. It's good to be back. How are you?
Great. And what time is it there in Australia, Simon?
Just after 9 o'clock, 9:15 on a sunny spring day.
In the morning, right?
Yep.
All right. And Gerardo, thanks for setting this up. It's so awesome when you bring to me an awesome episode.
Yeah. Simon is awesome. So we're super glad to have him back. I'm super excited.
Gerardo, really quick. I have noticed a particular passion of yours for this episode, and so I just thought it would be interesting to just have you begin and maybe talk about why you care so much about this issue, and also if there's anything about your origins, being born and raised in Mexico, that makes you feel passionately about this topic.
Yeah. So as some may know, I was raised Mormon in Mexico, and I grew up learning or being taught that I had Lamanite blood and that I was descendant from the Lamanites. And growing up in the church, like, we always heard about how the Mayan ruins, because I'm from the Yucatan Peninsula, actually, where Michael Coe did most or a lot of his research on Mayan culture, and you've had Michael Coe on Mormon Stories, talking about Book of Mormon evidence, correct?
Twice.
Yeah.
It's one of my proudest interviews. He's a Yale Mesoamerican archaeologist, and he's a legend, and he just passed away. Him and Robert Rittner both passed away within the past year, which is a huge loss.
Yes, for sure. And I brought him up because I grew up right there, right at the heart of all these cultures, and where all this where like a lot of a great population of Mormons believe that the Book of Mormon events happened right there or around that area in Central America and what's now Latin America. And
I served my mission in Guatemala, and I remember people coming to Guatemala all the time to do these kind of Book of Mormon archaeological tours, where they would go to in Petén and places in southern Mexico and the Yucatan Peninsula, because all these BYU professors were kind of making money off of making Mormons feel or believe that they were viewing actual Nephite and Lamanite ruins, right?
Yeah. And this is still happening. If you go today to Tulum, which is this archaeological site by Cancun, which is pretty close to my home, there's this family. I'm not sure if they ever got degrees, but they have license to do tours in the archaeological site, and they will give what they call Mormon tours for Mormons, where they will guide you through the site and they will show you like the ruins, and they will explain how they correlate or they're related to the Book of Mormon. So this is like this is pretty strong belief by members there, and that's probably, well, most of our listeners will know, like, members here in the US also believe that the events of the Book of Mormon probably happen in that area. Like you said, BYU professors and most apologists of the church will all or believe that that's the area where the Book of Mormon took place. So and also growing up, I always heard from my dad and from other leaders that in the US there was this big group of people who believed that actually the Book of Mormon took place in North America, or what is now the United States. And we always saw them as kind of like these weird people. Like we don't understand why do they even believe that? Because like at one point, even if I'm correct, like in the 40s or 50s, the church used to print on the Book of Mormon just pictures of Mayan ruins and just like archaeological, like what they called like some archaeological evidence of the Book of Mormon. So we knew that kind of like the brethren in some way, they kind of like used to or may still lean towards the Central America theory or area for Book of Mormon events having taken place in. And so yeah, we always saw them as kind of like just like kind of weird, like that there were people believing that. And so when Simon made a post on Facebook on our Mormon Stories community Facebook group about his research on Rodney Meldrum and his recent event that he held, which actually our other co-host Kara Burrell attended, I was like, oh, we need to bring Simon on Mormon Stories to talk to us about all this stuff and why are these people and like people like Rodney Meldrum claiming that the Book of Mormon events took place in what's now the United States.
Okay. Thank you, Gerardo, for giving us kind of that background. And I can, knowing that Mormon church leaders would come to Central America and South America and even the Pacific Islands and tell all of the members there that they literally are, descendants of Lamanites, makes it very personal, because when you tell somebody their identity, who their ancestry are, and we've talked about this with Simon in previous episodes, that's a really serious thing to be doing. And so, I can see why that's something very personal to you. Simon, I didn't tell you ahead of time I'd be doing this, but I think it would be super helpful if we could just spend maybe 5 minutes just talking about kind of what we understand Joseph Smith's understanding to have been about where the Hill Cumorah was and where the Book of Mormon sort of took place, then talk about why there was a need to move it to Central America and for the emergence of the two Hill Cumorahs theory, because then that sets up and the consensus that emerged over time with the brethren and past prophets, seers, and revelators about where the Book of Mormon took place, because then that sets up why there would even need to be an emergence of Rodney Meldrum and his Heartland theory. Do you think we can do that in just a few minutes? And is that okay if we cover that, Simon?
We're going to cover that, I think, partly through the talk. But I think originally, I don't think Joseph Smith sort of said, okay, that hill there, that's Cumorah, partly because it was just so obvious. It's like I don't point over there and say that's Canberra to everyone that I meet that lives in Canberra, because it's just, it's just so obvious. But it's quite clear that the God that was talking to Joseph Smith, as recorded in the Doctrine and Covenants, viewed the American Indians living in North America as Lamanites. There's absolutely no denying it. It's quite clear in the Doctrine and Covenants that the Indians, as they refer to them at the western frontiers, were Lamanites. And so I think everyone, as a consequence, at the time would have viewed Lamanites, Native Americans, as exactly the same thing. But really, the last 2 centuries, science has just shed incredible light on the origin of Native Americans, and it doesn't sit well with the beliefs of the church, and so there's been a fairly significant retreat away from this sort of hemispheric view. And now, as you were discussing earlier, Gerardo, it's basically centered on the Mayan civilization in Central America.
And
So,
Simon, for those who don't know at all, I
Mhm.
mean, it maybe Joseph didn't like specifically point to the hill and say this is Cumorah, but
Mhm.
he also didn't say there's two hills and that somehow Moroni buried the plates in one hill somewhere and that they
Yeah.
magically reappeared in another. Like if there's not a lot of specific association to the hill Cumorah, and the church itself calls it the hill Cumorah pageant at
That's
the hill
right. Yeah.
Cumorah. So I
Yeah.
mean, there's pretty much no doubt that the Mormon Church acknowledges the hill
Mhm.
in Palmyra, near Joseph Smith's home. It's pretty clear the church says that is hill Cumorah. And yet somehow everything moved to Mesoamerica at some point. What was the reasoning that things got moved to Mesoamerica, and why this two Cumorah theory emerged?
Well, there's sort of three main reasons. The first one is that the people of the Book of Mormon had a written language, and the only civilization in the Americas that had a written language was the Maya civilization. In fact, that's the main reason. But also, the Mayan civilization existed at roughly the right time, or before and after the Book of Mormon time period, and it was very large, quite a large civilization. So it had cities and a written language, and so that's why they've shifted to the Mayan civilization in Central America. But it's just been a general contraction to Mesoamerica, and then to the Maya. And as I'll show later on in a slide, the science has been particularly unkind because the Mayan population has been studied quite closely at the molecular level. So both mitochondrial DNA and genomic DNA is clearly showing what their ancestry is. So, and there's no sign of pre-Columbian Israelite DNA in the Mayan population. So,
And is it true, Simon, that if you study the Book of Mormon and distances that were traveled over with matching the description of a certain number of days, if the Book of Mormon was happening over when they say like there were cities or populations that covered the entire area, if the descriptions about volume of people and of distances, if they were talking about the entire North, Central, and South America, it would have just taken too long from people to go from tip to tip or point to point.
Yeah.
And so that's one reason they needed to shrink the area. And then if you need advanced civilizations, again, that's like you said, that's in Central America. And for those types of reasons, are those also some of the reasons why they needed to put it in Central America? Because if you just kind of take parts of Guatemala and southern Mexico and the Yucatan, that fits like the types of distances or geographical square mileage that would match the length of time it took Book of Mormon characters to travel from point to point. Is that?
Yeah. Well, I think it's probably also true to say that the distances that the Heartland model has now, by focusing on the Midwest, the heartland of North America, the distances probably fit reasonably well there. And so, the hemispheric view, which is clearly false, well, as they all are in my view, but it doesn't sort of make sense. But I guess that Joseph Smith wasn't a particularly good geographer. But the distance problem is resolved quite happily for the Heartland folk, and in fact, I think there's a lot of their arguments center around how well it aligns with the sort of traditional view and the things that Joseph Smith said. When you've got Doctrine and Covenants scripture backing up your claim that Lamanites are everywhere around the folk in North America, you can't get much better than that.
Right.
Okay. So in spite of the very lengthy takedowns of Rodney Meldrum by Fair and Farm's apologists, to be honest, I think he's got a pretty, quite a strong evidence base there when it comes to looking at LDS history and the scriptures.
And we'll jump into that. So here there are two things that I think we can establish: that Joseph Smith made it pretty clear that he felt like the Hill Cumorah was in upstate New York, and that the Book of Mormon dealt with pretty much all Native Americans, North, Central, and South, but that at some point the institutional Mormon Church obtained pretty much a solid consensus, including prophets, seers, revelators, and traditional Mormon apologists like Hugh Nibley, like John Sorensen, that it needed to kind of happen in Central America, kind of southern Mexico and Guatemala, and that's what prophets, seers, revelators, and mainstream members and apologists kind of have felt and believed for a long time, even though the church has wanted to avoid making an official declaration. The general understanding, including BYU's own apologists, shifted at some point to where it happened in Central America. Is that all okay?
Well, I think, just to clarify, I think it shifted, the scholars shifted to Mesoamerica way before the church leaders. In fact, I think you would find that there would be quite a few of the senior leaders now that still believe it's hemispheric. Spencer W. Kimball, he referred to there being 60 million Lamanites scattered across the Americas and into Polynesia. So I would say virtually every one of the apostles would have, for most of their lives, believed that it was hemispheric and that all American Indians were Lamanites. And I think they've just gradually shifted back from, I don't know, they've publicly, not many have publicly endorsed, I think, the Mesoamerican model, the limited geography. I think the problem for the church is that all of this Mesoamerican limited geography apologetics that's been going on for decades was mostly restricted to academic journals, and hardly anyone in the church saw it. Well, now the internet's come along, and everyone who has even a mild interest in looking at the historicity of the Book of Mormon is now being exposed to this very restricted model in Mesoamerica. And that, I think, is what sparked the emergence of Rodney Meldrum's Heartland Model. Is not just the DNA, it's the shock. And we'll talk about this later in I'm sure at length. But I think that's what sparked it. Not just DNA, it was the shock of seeing how much LDS scholars at BYU had conceded to science. Because it's clear what's happened. There hasn't been any revelation to tell them that's Mesoamerica.
Okay.
No direction from above. This is coming from scholars who have faced the science, and science is dictating where this could possibly be. And the DNA is obviously making it even more challenging to defend it. Okay,
so maybe let me try and restate it this way. So Joseph Smith and almost all subsequent prophets, seers, and revelators took the hemispheric model, which is that all Native Americans, North, Central, and South America, and Pacific Islanders, they were all, descendants of the Lamanites, and that the Book of Mormon happened throughout all of it. Then once faithful scholars started really studying the science, they started realizing that didn't make sense. And so we have emerging into into farms and eventually BYU, Maxwell Institute, and FAIR, this limited geography theory that tries to put it in Central America so that there's at least some hope for scientific credibility with the Book of Mormon happening in real space and time. That's kind of what emerged as the consensus for people who call themselves scholarly Mormon apologists. And from that consensus, then the Rodney Meldrum, his Heartland theory has emerged as a reaction to that. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
All right. So I think we're ready. Gerardo,
I added a slide. So if you go just to the second slide after, just with a quote by Joseph Smith. And this is a quote that Mike Joheimer, he is the author of LDS Discussions. Yeah. He gave it to me yesterday. And it's just a quote from a letter that Joseph Smith wrote in 1833, where he says, I'm going to read it. He says, "The Book of Mormon is a record of the forefathers of our Western tribes of Indians." So he makes it clear that it's the Western tribes of Indians. He says, "Having been found through the ministerial of an holy angel, translated into our own language by the gift and power of God, after having been hid up in the earth for the last 1400 years, containing the words of God which was delivered unto them. By it, we learned that our Western tribes of Indians are descendants from that Joseph that was sold in Egypt, and that the land of America is a promised land unto them." And that's another point that, I mean, we'll talk about, I think, eventually, is that Rod Meldrum makes, is that the Book of Mormon promises that the land of where the Book of Mormon events took place was going to become fruitful and just like successful in some way, because he was going to be the promised land for the Gentiles that were going to come. And he says that only fits in the United States, pretty much.
Yeah, that's pretty clear that Joseph Smith, I mean, when he's talking about Western tribes, that's got to mean the they're settling the Northeast. And so that means the tribes directly west of New York, right? Yeah. So I'm already starting to see where this is going.
and they use a phrase that it's called Joseph knew, and we'll see it on the clip that you're going to play.
Yeah. Okay, so we kind of know where Joseph stood. We've tried to give a brief overview of the history. Is there anything else, Simon, you want to say before we jump into the video?
No, let's just jump in.
What is this video? Just so our viewers and listeners know what this video is. Gerardo, do you want to just tell
yes, sorry. So this is a trailer. So in 2008, Rod Meldrum made this video of several hours long, just explaining Book of Mormon evidences regarding this Heartland model. One of the main evidences is what we're going to be talking about today, is the genetic evidence that Rod Meldrum had found. He brought several scientists on this video who we're going to talk about later too. But this is pretty much an introduction of the Heartland model, and this was the trailer for that.
All right, let's roll the tape. Let's roll the tape.
Which is greater, faith or knowledge? And your faith is dormant because you know. Where in the world did the Book of Mormon actually occur?
It has to be a land of liberty and freedom. His choice above all other lands has to be in the United States, because there's nothing like the U.S. of A. any place on earth.
We found 36 very specific prophecies and promises in the text of the Book of Mormon. Prophecies and promises about the land and the people, or the Gentiles, who will be led to this promised land in the latter days. Joseph Smith, claiming to have received revelation, wrote it down and put his name to it in regard to the geography of the Book of Mormon. Found this definite link between people in the Americas and the Middle East. They needed to find out whether or not it was ancient. How did X2 get from the Mediterranean area into the Americas? These Mayan ruins have become the icon for the Book of Mormon. Which one of those were God's people? The Hebrews. Which one of them built grand structures? The Egyptians. The Romans and the Jews. Who built grand structures? Why would it even be assumed that the Nephites would have built majestic ruins? Should the proposed method use the geographical passages over the spiritual passages? Doesn't make sense. We should use the spiritual passages over the geographical passage. And I, Nephi, did build the temple, and I did construct it after the manner of the temple of Solomon. That dimension is bigger than the pyramid of Giza, Chichen Itza, and the pyramid of the sun. This was a monumental earthwork. Most people don't even realize that it's right here in North America. You have to determine which type of evidence is stronger or more robust evidence than other types of evidence. This is a review of some of the evidence that indicates a North American setting for the Book of Mormon. What did Joseph Smith know about the geography of the Book of Mormon? Joseph Smith went up on this mound with the 12 brothers. He discovered that the person whose skeleton was before us was a white Lamanite. His name was Zelph. He was a warrior and chief. Behold, I say unto you, that you shall go unto the Lamanites and preach my gospel. The first missionaries who were sent unto the Lamanites went to tribes which today harbor haplogroup X DNA. How did Joseph Smith know that? If this geography is correct, Book of Mormon history is literally on the same sacred grounds as church history. We will find additional evidence strengthening the claims of the Book of Mormon because it is true.
Man, I'm sold. I'm sold because it's got that really cool Peruvian kind of flute music, and that persuadeth me. How can you argue with Peruvian flute music? Right?
South American flute music.
Well, this was the introduction. But he starts mentioning some of this stuff, right, that we have been talking about Joseph Smith going and saying that we should go and preach the Lamanites, and he was meaning the Indians over there, and just
so clearly the Indians or Native Americans on the frontier of Ohio and Illinois. Clearly, Joseph Smith identifies them as Lamanites.
Right.
Clearly, when he identifies Zelph, he sees some bones somewhere in the Midwest, and he says, "Hey, that's Zelph, the white Lamanite." So clearly, Joseph Smith believed, in at least a hemispheric model, if not a Heartland model. And then he's quoting DNA, which I'm sure piques your interest, Simon Southerton.
Well, it's the major claim that Rodney Meldrum makes.
Yeah.
In my view, it's the foundational claim, and he's not backed away from it in 15 years or more. And and everything else is built on that. I would agree with Rodney Meldrum in that he has got abundant, what he refers to as spiritual evidence, or basically, stuff written down in scripture, stuff said by Joseph Smith. There's abundant literature to back up his Heartland claims. But yeah, the XDNA is not linked to the Middle East, a recent migration.
Right.
Well, should we jump to the slide deck?
Sure.
All right, Professor. I'll call you Professor Southerton. Take it away.
Well, yeah, I've actually watched the emergence of the Heartland theory and Rodney Meldrum's ideas from pretty much day dot. Okay, so far too long. It's another one of my hobby horses. But it really does. We'll talk a little bit about what goes on before DNA came along, because I think Rodney's views were formed, his very fundamentalist views were formed many years before the DNA issue arose. But just after the turn of the century is when the DNA problem surfaced. I resigned as a bishop in 1998. It took me a couple of years to build up the courage to publish my ex-Mormon story, and then that I guess from then on the DNA issue became quite prominent. And then we had a number of publications from Thomas Murphy and myself, and then Brent Metcalf, that really raised how serious this issue was. And then there was just an absolute avalanche of apologetics from farms primarily, and then FAIR in the years afterwards. So Rodney.
Hey, Simon, if I can just
Yeah.
ask you, like, I remember I was working at Microsoft at the time. I remember learning about Thomas Murphy, being surprised that he lived in the state I was living in, and then seeing that there was going to be a disciplinary council to excommunicate him for the crime of just studying the DNA and publishing information that just basically said, we're not finding Hebrew or Lamanite DNA. We're not finding Hebrew DNA amongst the Native Americans. And that must have lit a fire at church headquarters, and I think it led to the changing of the title page of the Book of Mormon, because if 99.9% of the DNA for the descendants of the Native Americans come from Asia, and we'll be talking about this, then that's a problem. And that's is that why so many researchers started putting it in Mesoamerica? Let's just say BYU apologists started putting it in Mesoamerica because they needed to shrink the target to the smallest population possible, because otherwise the DNA evidence was too overwhelming. Is that why?
Well, the limited geography theory is largely a response to all of the other evidence apart from the genetic evidence. I mean, there was some genetic evidence prior to DNA being published, but the lack of evidence of an Israelite influence in the Americas caused them to sort of shrink their claims. And so I think it was largely because of the lack. They needed a written language, and the civilizations are about the right time and quite large. So that's, I think, the major driver. But when Rodney Meldrum came along, that really shocked him. I think. He was shocked by the DNA, but also by the response of the apologists. They were arguing, well, that's not really a problem because we have a limited geography. The Lamanites aren't everywhere; they're in a very restricted part of Mesoamerica, and because the internet exposed him to all of the apologetic arguments that had come along, and so he was desperate to find something to hang on to. There must be some scientific evidence that he could latch onto, and that's when he latched onto the X lineage. Now, the X lineage is interesting because it was a very rare lineage. It's a very rare lineage in the Americas. It's only found in North America, and it's only occurs at about 1% over the entire continent. So it's a rare lineage to begin with. It was probably even more rare in Asia. And to date, they have not found the ancestral X2A lineage in Asia. Okay, so the most ancient X2A lineage that they've found is Kennewick Man, which is what we'll talk about a bit later on. But Rodney created this story, which wasn't true, that scientists were confused by the X lineage and almost hid the fact that it was also found in the Middle East as almost like a cover-up. And this is a common theme that I've observed with Rodney Meldrum. He believes that scientists are being dishonest frequently and hiding evidence. And so he created this idea amongst people that scientists were unsure about the X lineage. And it really only stems from the fact that it was a very rare lineage in Asia. And it's the ancestral lineage has not been found, or a related ancestral lineage has not been found in Asian populations. But my guess is that if they sequenced or sampled anywhere near the number of people that they've tested in the Americas in sort of the right area in Asia, they would probably find an ancestral X2A lineage. But even if they don't, it's very quite possible for a very rare lineage to just go extinct in the original place. I mean, it's possible that the X2A lineage arose and everyone that carried it migrated across to the Americas. We just don't know. So, but he's latched onto the X lineage, and I was in contact with Rodney within probably months or a few years of him making the claims that he was making, because he was starting to do little small cottage meetings and conferences, and pointed out the fact that the X lineage was ancient. It's been in the Americas for just as long as the others. But from that, he's then hooked up with lots of other people, and they're sort of really built, based on the X lineage claim, this idea that it was centered in the Book of Mormon events took place in North America, and that Lehi sailed from Arabia around Africa, okay, which is a very, very perilous voyage, I can assure you, around the tip of Africa, and then up into more likely landing in Florida or somewhere like that. And then they colonized, the Book of Mormon people colonized the Ohio and the Mississippi Valley. So there are two cultures that appear prominently in Heartland discussions, and that's the Adena and the Hopewell cultures. These are woodland cultures within the Ohio and the Mississippi Valley. The Adena were the earlier culture. I think they sort of arose around about 500 BC and sort of petered out around about 100 AD. And the Hopewell culture arose sort of around about 100 AD and then petered out around 500 or 600 AD. So these are the mound builders, the mound builder culture. So if we go to the next slide, I mean, the Heartland theory has a lot of appeal for members of the church. But it's important to note that it aligns completely with young earth creationism. So virtually all of the Heartlanders are young earth creationists.
And for those who don't know what that term means, I know it's obvious, but Simon, tell.
Yeah, so these are people that believe that the earth is literally 7,000 years old. Adam and Eve were placed on the earth. And then there was a global flood, which killed everyone but 4,500 years ago, that killed everyone but Noah's family.
And Simon, tell me if I'm wrong, but Mormonism really relies on a young earth creationist view, not just because Mormons believe the Bible is literally history, that Adam and Eve literally were the first parents. Many prophets, seers, and revelators in the past have condemned evolution, and we'll talk about that later, that the global flood was real. Even the Book of Moses, as John Larson has reminded us, relies on Noah being a real person and his children, and the curse of Ham, all comes, in Scripture. Even the Jaredites in the Book of Mormon, they come over around the time of the scattering of the Tower of Babel, so you need a literal Tower of Babel. And then even I think, doesn't the Doctrine and Covenants even state that the earth is 6,000 or 7,000 years old? Like, in every possible way, Mormonism is built on, you could say, the rock or the sand of young earth creationism. Is that all true?
You could say that. There is abundant scriptural evidence to back it up, including the fact that the global flood wiped out everyone in the Americas, so the promised land was cleared of humans. It was also because Adam-on-Diamond was where Adam lived, and presumably Noah was, I don't know, a couple of thousand years later. The ark had to get to the other side of the world, so it sailed across there. So it all does fit with that, but it's unfair to sort of refer to all. I don't think. I guess when I was a member, I felt like most of the people I was around at church were young earth creationists, but that's not the case with LDS scientists and scholars. The vast majority of those scholars who have any training in science would shun young earth creationism very, very resolutely. So it's not and I think it's fair to say that there would be quite a large number of members of the church who wouldn't view themselves as young earth creationists. They have this sort of, it's one of those things that's up on the shelf. They haven't resolved it all yet. So
Well,
By
I just
by the time I reached BYU in the late 80s, the entire biology department, including former mission presidents and stake presidents, and we're all teaching evolution being factual. So those who think that, and the church has carefully chosen not to take a formal position on evolution anymore, but it's pretty clear that even the most faithful believing Mormon scientists accept evolution as a valid theory, correct, Simon?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. So that ship is
And
sailed for people who care about science. More for believing Mormons who value and care about science, that ship is
yeah,
pretty much sailed. Evolution is a fact, and the
yeah.
Earth is billions of years old.
Well, I think it's worth. When I first encountered the DNA, and I read the apologetic material, I did sense that they were quite careful not to touch those beliefs. Don't talk too much about how long American Indians have been in the continent, that sort of thing. When Ryan Parr criticised my book, he referred to the original colonisation of the Americas as a multiple millennial stroll. He's done research that shows that it's 15,000 years ago. You're referring it to as a multiple millennial stroll. That'll keep the creationists happy because it's only a couple of thousand years. So yeah, it's but there are it's so yeah. So the apologists were fairly coy about challenging creationists or young Earth creationist type views in the church, but when DNA came along, this created a unique challenge for them because all of a sudden, to get out of this mess, they needed real scientists. They needed scientists with DNA knowledge to come in. Scott Woodward, Michael Whiting, Keith Crandall. Who else is there? There's Ugo Perego. Ugo Perego, who wrote the church's DNA essay. All of these people, except evolution, all of these people know that American Indians have been in the country, in the Americas for 15,000 years. That doesn't align with the global flood.
Or the Book of Mormon itself either, right? Like, because the Book of Mormon says, I think, that before the Jaredites, no one had inhabited the land before, or something like that.
So we get back to the slide. So one of the appeals was that it was young, but it also, the Heartland idea aligns with many of the traditional beliefs that members of the church have. So virtually everyone, or the vast majority of the church, thinks the Hill Cumorah in New York is the Hill Cumorah. And so having a second Cumorah in Mesoamerica, that's really out there. It's a very challenging idea. How do you get the plates? And there were multiple plates. There's lots of stuff. How was all that material transported to North America? But you've also got the doctrine, as we talked earlier, the Lamanites are clearly specified in the Doctrine and Covenants. But another thing is that it appeals to American nationalism in a big way. If you go along to a Firm Foundation conference, you just see rows of American flags everywhere. Okay, I can't see the Heartland ideas having much appeal to many people outside of America.
Yeah,
I mean, it is just hyper nationalism that they're seeing, and this aligns with Manifest Destiny. This idea that America is God's chosen country. But the other thing, it also appeals to people who get drawn into conspiracy theories. And one of those conspiracies, I think, sadly reflects fairly poorly on the whole organization, and that is this idea that American scientists are hiding the evidence of the civilizations in North America. In order to,
and I've heard that. I've heard that
that's a
from
common
people.
theme. It's a common theme when you read. I've got a quote from Rodney Meldrum later on. But the other thing is they're very, very critical of BYU scientists who've been drawn into accepting the science and conceding the science. But I think the overall foundational appeal of the Heartland idea is that it is sort of very well aligned with how the Book of Mormon came about. The Book of Mormon arose because of the Moundbuilder myth. It inspired the Book of Mormon. And I think the Moundbuilder myth is basically inspiring the Heartland theory today. It's just 200 years later.
And remind our listeners what the Moundbuilder myth is, Simon.
Well, as American colonists moved west over the Appalachian Mountains into the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, they encountered mounds everywhere. Like within just a few miles of Joseph Smith's home, there were, I think, about 7 mounds. And it was just the burial practices of the local Indigenous, the First Nations people in that area. They would bury somebody in a mound, and then somebody else would die, and then they would expand the mound and bury more relatives in the mound. But there were quite a lot of earthworks in the area. But the native cultures, the native peoples that knew the origin of the mounds had basically been wiped out by the diseases that were advancing ahead of European colonists as they were moving west. And so there was limited knowledge amongst the local remaining people about how these mounds were built. And so this myth emerged that there'd been a white race of advanced people who had built the mounds, and the dark-skinned Native Americans had wiped them out at some stage in the past, and then they were the people that remained in the area. Now, if you can't see the obvious similarity of that myth with the central plot of the Book of Mormon, then you're not really trying very hard. It's quite clear that the darker-skinned Lamanites aligned very well with the people that were remaining in the area, and the white-skinned race would have been the Nephites that were wiped out. So I believe that's what's really... Yes, I think that Moundbuilder myth has inspired. I believe that it inspired, and many other, Fawn Brody and many other scholars who've looked at the Moundbuilder myth would see that it has inspired the story of the Book of Mormon.
I'm pretty sure the Tanners and others have found maybe 15 books that occurred prior to the Book of Mormon that basically claimed very similar things, that Native Americans were descendants of the 12 tribes or descendants of Israel or Jerusalem in some way. And this idea of the light-skinned and the dark-skinned people. View of the Hebrews just being one of like 12 or 15 books that had the same story, a decade even or two before Joseph Smith ever came up with it. And I remember, reading about Thomas Jefferson himself having mounds around his house. And, these beliefs went back as early as the mid 1700s, because you need some way to demonize and dehumanize the people that you're displacing. You have to dehumanize them. And so like the Black priesthood, like the curse of Cain teaching, the mark is the dark skin. You need some way to make them dehumanized so you can displace them. So it's a very racist theory at its core. Am I right?
Yeah, well, I guess the other thing was that the mounds were, they were very compelling because they also had quite elaborate, breastplates and metalwork. Much of it was from native copper, that I think was from Michigan, but also there were some mounds where they had, steel objects, and that was because they had obtained them, from Europeans at some point, and then when somebody died that had one of these very valuable steel objects, they buried them with them. So that was very common. So,
but
that's probably where
after 1500, right? That would have been after. Would have acquired those things from Europeans.
So the influence of Europeans advanced, often probably centuries before colonizers got into an area. because of you have these extensive trade networks where people would be trading way out into the middle of America, as Native Americans did prior to Europeans arriving.
Got it.
So yeah, so the Heartland model is very appealing, but as I mentioned earlier, I think it's worth going back and so I've mentioned that young Earth creationism in this slide, but I didn't actually I wasn't really sure whether Rodney Meldrum was a young Earth creationist until about 5 years ago, because it emerged about 5 years ago that he was heavily involved with the development of the universal model. And this was back in the 90s. So I think he actually attended the church in Arizona at one stage with Dean Sessions. Well, that's where he got involved with Dean Sessions. So Dean Sessions he's got an organizational psychology degree from BYU. And he has spent probably close to a quarter of a century building this universal model, which basically, in my view, is an attempt to write scientific textbooks that support creationism. So he's published 2 of these volumes. One of them, the first volume, I think, is designed to prove that Noah's flood was real. So, the things like the Grand Canyon was created in basically in a day after the flood waters receded, that sort of thing. His next volume disproves evolution and proves the Earth is 7,000 years old. And he's got another volume coming out on the universe system.
Do we know his scientific credentials so that he can defy the global consensus of scientists worldwide? He's got to be.
Well, he's got to be
like
It's a Bachelor of Science degree, but it's mostly in psychology.
He doesn't have like 50 PhDs to be able to attack all geography.
No, he hasn't got a PhD.
Physics and no. Okay, I'm sorry.
So, I mean, this is a claim he makes. The universal model includes more natural law and scientific truth than any other scientific work ever published. That's a pretty bold claim.
Yeah.
And it's a claim that irritates Brigham Young University, I know, because the student magazine at Brigham Young University publicized a conference somewhere where Dean Sessions was going to present the universal model, and they wrote a complaint. The geology department wrote a very, very firmly worded complaint about this advertising this nonsense. This is crackpottery at the extreme.
One of our listeners writes, "Why do you need a degree if the Holy Ghost can just give you the truth?"
That's right.
From Bradley. Thank you, Bradley.
So I mean, if anyone wants to look into this a bit further, they should look at some work that Barry Bickmore, a professor of geology at BYU, has published on his own blog. He's actually met Dean Sessions. So Dean Sessions came in to discuss some of his geology claims. And one of them is that he believes that the Earth is sitting on the core of the Earth is water. Can you see where this is going? Can you see where you need water?
My co-producer, my co-host on Mormon Stories, she attended the Book of Mormon, geography conference? What's it called, Gerardo? Just a month or two ago?
Yeah, I'm not sure the name, but
it's probably the Foundation
video of these speakers with large audiences claiming that the core of the Earth was water, not molten lava,
not magma.
Yeah, not magma.
I mean, I haven't read his book, and I never will because I don't have the time. They're 2,500 pages. These 3 books. These are enormous. filled with illustrations and whatever. But can you imagine why you need to have the middle of the earth, lots of water there?
I
Because you
mean,
need a global flood.
Yeah,
what's
for the
that?
global
That's
flood- for the
where else
global
does the
flood.
water go? Because basically, if the earth could be covered with water,
Yeah.
but
gotta
then
come
the
from
water has
somewhere.
to recede. I mean, I guess Heavenly Father could take the water up in like a kind of like a cyclone swirly thing. But absent of that, you need the water to go somewhere, right?
I think the Bible mentions that the
The water recedes into the earth.
the water came from below the earth. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
So
anyway,
there's got to be full of water, basically.
but look, there are lots of people that have. But it is interesting. I went for 10 years not realizing. So Rodney Meldrum kept this close to his chest. He didn't. Maybe when he was at conferences, he would be a bit more open about it. But anything he published, he didn't sort of come out as a young Earth creationist. But it's quite clear that he's been a young Earth creationist from day dot all the way. And in many ways, while he has built the Heartland theory on the X2A lineage, the entire thing is built on the universal model. So, I mean, Dean Sessions, he's the man. He's the man that came up with the science that underpins this whole thing.
And he's part of this foundation or this organization called the FairMormon.
He's heavily involved with that. So he now speaks. Dean Sessions now speaks at most of the Firm Foundation conferences on the universal model. And I mean, I think he's a academic at a college somewhere in Utah where they teach the universal model to a small number of kids. But so anyway, I think and the next, I mean, the method that Dean uses, that's the website.
So there's Dean Sessions' website.
Yeah,
he's the author of the universal model.
Yeah, and Barry Bickmore, I've got a link there'll be on your website a link to Barry Bickmore's response or his interaction with Dean Sessions, and I agree entirely with Barry's assessment of what's going on here. Dean Sessions is a Gish galloper. Look, if we go to the next slide, it's now back slide. Gish. There was a guy named Dwayne Gish. He died about 10 years ago, but he was a young Earth creationist, and a very, very successful debater against scientists. And the approach that he would use was he'd go into a debate and he would just throw the opponent a whole pile of really weak and dubious claims across a whole lot of scientific disciplines. And it was a very, very effective debating technique because his opponents, well, firstly, it made him look really impressive. It made it made him look like he was an expert across a whole pile of fields, but his opponents were just completely swamped. Because usually if somebody makes a false or specious claim, they can do that in about 5 seconds. But to respond effectively to that claim often takes you 10 minutes.
Yeah.
So if somebody just bangs out 15 of these specious claims, the opponents are completely overwhelmed because they feel like they've got to respond to every one of them in order to answer him. And so they don't have enough time. They don't have the expertise to comment on all of the different fields of research. But more often than not, they just don't have the energy. And like me, I don't have the energy to read Dean Sessions' books because there'll be just thousands and thousands of these weak, specious claims and I'm not an expert in all those fields. So,
So
I'm just
checkmate.
I'm not going to waste. So I'm done.
Checkmate.
And this is
wins by volume alone.
That's right. I'm sunk.
Ironically, FairMormon claims Jeremy Runnels is a Gish Galloper with the CES letter, but that's another podcast. I just had to note that. Okay, so
well, I will point out there is another Gish Galloper that I'm going to mention later on.
Okay,
and that is John Sorensen. John Sorensen is a enormous Gish Galloper because he's the architect of the limited geography theory.
Mm-hmm.
We'll talk a little bit about that a bit later on. So if we go to the next slide, I think this is the elephant in the room. Okay, this is the underlying problem that I think the young Earth creationists are struggling with. Human evolution is a huge threat to the idea that the human race has been on the Earth for 7,000 years. But as quite a well-respected BYU professor says to his first-year students every year, this is something I've heard on grapevine, but I'm sure it's true. He would tell all of his new first-year biology students that evolution is a fact. Get over it. That was the very first thing he would tell the biology students coming in, because they would all come in, the vast majority of them, believing that the Earth was 7,000 years old. But there's just abundant evidence for evolution, and DNA, which wasn't even known about when the theory of evolution was first advanced by Charles Darwin. The most powerful evidence of evolution, and in fact the mechanism of how evolution occurs, is all written in our DNA. It explains everything very beautifully. And this slide, I think, shows you how beautifully DNA underpins evolution. If you look at animals that look much more closely related to us, they have much more gene homology. So we have striking gene homology with many other animals on the planet, even fish. So, but there's also a degree of DNA homology. So there's a bit of a difference there. Genes is a long stretch of DNA, which codes for a protein. So that they refer to that as a gene, and that is gene homology on the left. But DNA homology also really confirms our very close relationship with other primates and other animals. But I've just listed some primates there, the percentage of DNA homology. So if we were to pick a random person and compare their genome to yours, John, it would be around about 99.95% homologous. If we go to our next
male and female, that's male and female.
Yeah. Well, if you exclude that's right. If you just ignore the Y chromosome for a moment, but so it's about 99.95% identity. So 0.05% is still a lot of mutations. It's probably about 6 million. But if we go to our next closest relative, that's Neanderthal.
Yeah.
And we all carry around about 2 to 3 or 4% of Neanderthal DNA in our genomes. It's about 99.7%. Another ancient relative, Denisovans, is similar to Neanderthal in terms of how different it is from us, and we've interbred with Denisovans as well. But there's a little bit less there. But as you can see, the further we get down the list, that homology just sort of drops away. Drops away. But DNA is just, it's evolution gets lampooned in the church, and occasionally you'll get. Obviously, the current prophet has mocked evolution fairly recently. But if you go to BYU, it's just it's widely accepted. But the other thing,
I would say BYU Provo. My experience going to BYU Idaho was I saw someone on the comments. Let me pull it up really quick.
While you're looking that up, Gerardo, I'm just going to say for the listeners who can't see the slide, what the slide basically says is that we share 60% DNA with chickens, 71% with fish, 80% with mice, 80% with cows, 90% with cats. And then when you start getting into the primates like gorillas, chimpanzees, etc., we're talking 98+%. And I think, Simon, just the really simple conclusion there is that it just makes just way too much sense that if animals get more and more human-like, the DNA is more and more similar. It means it's just another of so many evidences that we kind of likely share a lineage that is best explained by evolution.
Yeah.
And the fossil record has these animals existing for hundreds of thousands of years in lower life forms. And so again, that's going to be bolstering the multi-billion year Earth model, not the 7,000 year Earth model, right, Simon?
Yeah.
Okay. What were you saying, Gerardo?
Just my experience at BYU Idaho taking science class, it was closer to what Bradley's experience was. He says in BYU science classes, they would put up quotes on both sides of evolution and say you could think any way you wanted in good company. It didn't matter because it's not a saving ordinance. That was my experience going to BYU Idaho and taking a science class. They would show us like the old quotes by Joseph Fielding Smith, by Spencer W. Kimball, and then show us what the scientific community believes. And then they would make us read as well, like some, I think there was, I don't know if he was a general authority, maybe someone related to current President Eyring, who believed in evolution. And then they would make us read his just his arguments pro evolution, and then kind of like just say like you can believe whatever you want. But it was not as like hard cut, like this is what happened kind of thing.
I think it's possible, in fact it's probably more than likely that BYU has become more conservative.
Because when I was at BYU in the early 90s, Bill Bradshaw was there in the biology department. I don't think there's any biology class or science class anywhere at BYU Provo in the late 80s, early 90s that would have done that, Gerardo. There might have been some religious professors that would do that. But by the time I was at BYU in the late 80s, early 90s, evolution was broadly accepted in biology classes as being valid.
Yeah, and that would be the same with all of the current academics in their academic work. So if they're saying that in, the sorts of things you're saying, Gerardo, in current lectures, what they're saying there, they're just putting up that because they've been told to put that up.
That could be
true. They would all accept evolution.
And it shows how extreme BYU Idaho, traditionally has been in the church. It's Yeah. And it's also where Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow centered their behavior. It's a really rough spot for the church.
So that's a good quote from the current prophet.
So we have a quote here. It's a meme, right, from Mist and Sunday. And it's a quote from Russell M. Nelson from 2007. Well, where it was an interview at the research center. It says Pew Research Center. He says, "To think that man evolved from one species to another is to me incomprehensible. Man has always been man. Dogs have always been dogs. Monkeys have always been monkeys. It's just the way genetics works."
Wow, Simon, that's how genetics works.
They've done some, there's a Russian scientist who basically evolved dogs from wolves or foxes. I can't remember what it was. by naturally selecting ones that were more tame and, you know, better behaved and didn't bite his hand when he fed them or whatever. So dogs have always been dogs. Oh my goodness. I mean, dogs are amazing evidence for evolution. Look, you know, President Nelson was an amazing cardiologist, but he's completely ignorant when it comes to evolution. And I suspect he's probably not going to make any more statements about it. But yeah, these are very problematic comments that obviously would irritate many of the scientists at Brigham Young University. But I think it illustrates the problem that the church has here. It's fine to get up over the pulpit and bash evolution at church. You don't get in trouble for that. But if he went along to Brigham Young University, you would never hear him say things like that. So you have this hypocrisy going on. You have the church saying one thing in public meetings and everyone's comfortable with it. The church is funding a university over here filled with scientists that know that what they're saying in church isn't true. It's just, yeah, I think they've sort of created the problem in many ways. And you know, in referring to the Heartland theory, I think the church has also contributed to creating this Heartland problem. But if we get back to DNA, the other thing, DNA tells us a great deal about how related we are, but it's also been amazing for revealing in very clear detail how humans have migrated around the world, particularly now that we've got capacity to isolate DNA from ancient bones that have been buried for tens, if not hundreds of thousands of years. And so there's now a very clear picture that's emerged of human migration around the planet. And DNA also enables, particularly now with genomic DNA, it enables scientists to determine roughly when humans arrived in particular areas.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that they could tell when they arrived.
Like there's a beautiful study just published in the Pacific. You know how we had a chat about Polynesians a few months ago? Well, I think about a couple of weeks later, they published a paper where they isolated DNA. Well, they took DNA from all of these Polynesian populations in eastern Polynesia, and by tracing the particular chunks of their chromosomes, which get broken down each generation, they're able to look back and see when people arrived on a particular island. And they mapped out precisely when humans arrived on particular islands all the way through eastern Polynesia. So they know almost to the decade when the Polynesians sailed to, say, Easter Island or Hawaii and New Zealand and places like that.
That's pretty cool.
So DNA, particularly genomic DNA, that's been used quite a lot to determine the timing of arrival in particular areas. But for today's chat, I think it's worth taking a look back and seeing what, if you look at the next slide, how.
Hey, Simon, do you mind if I just tell listeners what this slide actually says?
Sure.
Just listeners won't be able to see it. It basically says, it's saying that you know, we've been able to locate through genetic research and other research that humans existed in Africa around 200,000 years ago, or our ancestors, basically. And then you see that spreading into the Middle East by 100,000 years ago, spreading to Western Europe, well, spreading eastward to China around 70,000 years ago. And then there's a split off where it goes westward to Western Europe around 40,000 years ago. And then you've got it going down into Australia 60,000 years ago. And then over into America, you know, let's just say Alaska around 25,000 years ago. And then into South America about 15,000 years ago. So it shows these really clear migrations that show a slow migration of the human population across the earth in a very chronological way. But the big problem for the Book of Mormon is we've if North, Central, and South America were preserved by God for his chosen people, and that's what the Book of Mormon claims, then people shouldn't be showing up in North, Central, South America until, let's just say 1000 BC or 3000. Let's just say what, 3000 years ago?
BC.
What's that?
Yeah, about I think it's
2000 before Christ.
Well, 2000 years ago would be Christ, so Tower of Babel would be.
Yeah, so it's about I'm trying to think when the Jaredites claim. I think that was 2000 BC.
Okay, yeah, so then that'd be 4000 years ago, but that doesn't jive with humans entering North America 25,000 years ago, and spreading down into South America 15,000 years ago. So, I just wanted to make sure our listeners knew what that said. Okay, Simon.
Well, there was a fascinating piece of research that was just published this year on these footprints that were discovered in. I'm trying to think of the state. It was in, I think, New Mexico or somewhere down there. They discovered a whole series of footprints alongside the footprints of mammoths. And when they carbon dated seeds that had been pressed by those feet into the soil, and then it was covered over, they were 22 to 23,000 years old. So it's shifted back that entry point from 15,000 to 25. It's now probably 25,000 years ago. They were actually in the Americas before the ice had blocked the migrations. Yeah.
And it's worth noting those who like to mention the discovery of horse bones in the Americas. What they always fail to mention is that those horse bones date back to like 12,000 years ago, which again is prior to the Bible even allows for animals or humans potentially to exist. And so, okay, sorry, just had to add that.
Yeah, DNA is very useful for tracing human ancestry, obviously, and I'm going to talk a bit about. I'll present some mitochondrial DNA evidence, so it's worth just sort of reviewing what mitochondrial DNA is and how it's used to trace ancestry. So this slide shows a typical pedigree chart with 8 great-grandparents right down to 2 parents and then siblings. And all of us carry mitochondrial DNA, and it's a small circular molecule of DNA that's present not in our nucleus where all the rest of our DNA is, but out in the cytoplasm. And mitochondria are small compartments that generate the energy for the cell. And mitochondrial DNA, because it's such a small molecule compared to our genome's enormous, like it's a duplicate copy of 3 billion base pairs. The mitochondrial genome is only about 13,500 base pairs. So as DNA technology advanced, it was the easiest thing to study for probably a couple of decades, and then genomic studies have come on stream in the last decade or two. So mitochondrial DNA we all inherit from, because when the sperm fertilizes the egg, the mitochondrial DNA outside of the nucleus of the egg is what is carried on in the zygote and the developing embryo. And that mitochondrial DNA is always inherited from our mothers. So a father doesn't pass on his mitochondrial DNA, it's the mitochondrial DNA of the mother. So it's a simple uniparental DNA molecule which is passed generation to generation. And every now and then there's a little spelling mistake in somebody's mitochondrial DNA, and then that is passed on to their offspring. Every time a new spelling mistake occurs or a mutation, that's a branch point in what is then builds into a mitochondrial genome family tree. So some of the first mitochondrial DNA studies that were done in humans were done so the mitochondrial genome was first sequenced in 1980. It was about a decade later that some of the first mitochondrial studies were done looking at ancestry of humans across the world, and a paper published by Theodore Scher in 1990, and then many other papers subsequently, has revealed the ancestry of Native Americans. And if you look at the next slide, this shows some of the data, the accumulated data that's... Okay, I've just got a low battery warning on my computer.
no.
I need to duck down and turn the power on. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm going to go ahead while Simon is doing that, and just thank all our listeners for their comments. We've got plenty of people who are joining us and commenting, and those comments are valuable. Okay, Simon, are you back?
Oh, yeah, all good. The little green, I think it's charging. Yeah, it's charging now.
Okay, good. We don't want you
I
cutting
hadn't
out.
pushed the plug in probably. So
We've got Native American mitochondrial DNA.
yeah, so there are 5 lineages amongst Native Americans that enter the Americas from Asia. That's the A, B, C, and D lineages. So that gives you an indication of how early this was in the mitochondrial DNA studies, because they decided they're going to name them by the letters of the alphabet. First paper published, they took A, B, C, and D. The X2A lineage was a little bit, was sort of in the initial year or so, it was they were sort of working out where it sat. But now they've confirmed that it's been in the Americas for a long time, and it's a founding lineage amongst American Indians. So 99+% of contemporary or living Native Americans from right across the Americas have a mitochondrial lineage that originated in Asia, and a very small proportion, about 1% or less.
Can you say what percent again?
99%.
99% of Native Americans come from Asia. Is that what you're saying?
No, that's 99% of mitochondrial DNA of the individuals tested. 99% of them have a mitochondrial lineage that's derived from Asia. So the scientists interview the people in most cases to determine that they have no European ancestry. But some scientists maybe are not as careful, but there are also people who have European ancestry that they're unaware of, because Europeans have been in the Americas for 500 years. It's not surprising that you get a very small proportion that have a European lineage or an African lineage. So,
right.
And in many cases, when they've delved more deeply, they find that there are European lineage that's common in France or particularly Spain and Portugal. Then if we look in the second table there, the pre-Columbian individuals, there's 1,200 pre-Columbian, so they've taken DNA from ancient remains and determined their Native American, determined their mitochondrial DNA lineage, and they're all descended from Asia. So this is an enormous amount of work that's been done over the last 30 years, and there's really no sign of a Middle Eastern DNA presence. And it's even
Simon,
worse if you go, sorry?
And Simon, I don't want to cut you off. Let me finish your thought, and then I want to ask you a question.
I was just going to hop onto the next slide. So
okay,
probably best
so if a Heartland theory person that didn't understand what you were saying wanted to kind of interpret the slide, they would say, okay, well, that 1% is the opening. So if you can find 1%, because the Book of Mormon doesn't necessarily need to be over a very large geography, and because DNA can, be swamped or disappear over time, we only need 1% of Israeli DNA to be even available. Those are the modern day Lamanites that Joseph Smith was talking about, and they're the ones that have ancestors that come from the Middle East. What would you say in response to that?
Yeah, I mean that's clearly what the Heartlanders are claiming.
Okay.
But as we're going to talk quite a bit about the X2A lineage in a moment, so
okay, we'll hold off on that then.
Because I think they're claiming that they found it, right? Like the whole claim is that they have found the evidence to prove that.
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll look at that in fairly close detail.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. So with that in mind, with the mitochondrial DNA evidence, let's go back and look at this BYU's limited geography. So as recently as 10 years ago, they are linking the Mayan civilization with the people of the Book of Mormon. And the DNA has been equally unkind to the LDS claims that the Maya civilization would carry some, would include some of the descendants of Lehi. I mentioned earlier about gish galloping, and Mormon's Codex I would classify as a classic example of gish galloping. A parallel is basically a weak evidence. So currently there is no scientific evidence that Israelites beat Columbus to the Americas. No reliable. There's plenty of dubious claims and hoaxes and frauds, but there's no scientific evidence that's accepted outside of Vinland in North America. So that's Vinland off the coast of Canada. Just weeks ago, they determined by radiocarbon dating of tree rings on the buildings that were built there by Norse sailors that they colonized it exactly 1,000 years ago. So that's the earliest European arrival, but they don't appear to have stayed very long, and they left not long after, and the settlement was abandoned. Yeah, so, but yeah, if we get back to if the next slide shows the DNA evidence that's some of the DNA evidence related to the Mayan population, because it's quite a lot of the work that has been done on the Mayan population. If you look at ancient Mayans, the total Mayan population, number of Mayans that have had their mitochondrial DNA lineage determined, there's 1,108 individuals that have been tested. Of those 1,108, 1,103 were carrying an Asian mitochondrial lineage. 4 were carrying an African lineage, and 1 was carrying a European lineage. That European lineage was an H lineage, which is very common in Spain or Portugal. So if you look at ancient individuals, there's 138 individuals have been tested, and all 138 have an Asian mitochondrial DNA lineage. And there's a map there of the Yucatan Peninsula, and just indicating a number of the populations, a scattering of the populations that were included in the testing. And I don't have a slide to show this, but the whole genomes of several Mayan individuals have been tested. And if there was European DNA or if there was Jewish DNA in their ancestry from a long time ago, just like they've been able to detect Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA, it would be very easy to detect it. So
Simon, if I'm understanding the two DNA slides you just showed, that if they go back to the bones of ancient Native Americans, they're literally finding no European or African DNA at all.
I think these are living people.
No.
The ancient, they're the bones of ancient individuals.
The bones of ancient individuals are showing 0 African or European DNA. And if you look at sort of modern, Native Americans and or Mayans, they're only finding 1 to 5% European or African DNA. But the explanation would be that somehow in their ancestry, after 1500 AD, there would have been some African or European influences that crept into their ancestry, and that would explain why we're finding a tiny trace of African or European DNA in modern, Mayans or Native Americans. Is that what you're saying,
Yeah.
Simon?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, it's about 1%
Okay.
in the modern individuals. Working with ancient DNA is more challenging because you have this problem of the individuals who are, because the amount of DNA in the ancient remains is so tiny, just a little bit of skin or dandruff, contaminating that would completely swamp it. So, and they have to be extremely careful when they're handling these bones to avoid any contamination with the modern individual. So there would be, to be honest, they would normally what they would do is they would sequence the genome, the mitochondrial genome of all of the people in the lab that are working with that sample. And if there were any individuals that were, if they find any contaminant mitochondrial genomes, it'll match up with somebody in the lab and they'll throw that out. But yeah, the ancient samples, they're all showing mitochondrial DNA coming from Asia, and it's the same with the genome. The entire genome is backing that up.
And that's what archaeological and linguistic and all the other scientific disciplines also would validate that those sort of migration patterns from Asia into the Americas, right? It's not just genetics; it's all the other disciplines as well, linguistics, archaeology, etc. Okay, so now Rodney Meldrum.
We're back to the main topic of the day, the star of the show, Rodney. As you mentioned before, obviously the DNA evidence has created enormous problems for not only for the Heartland model, but for the Mesoamerican model. And BYU scientists, it's much, they're more constrained in how much they can twist or distort scientists. And to be fair to them, they haven't generally distorted the science. They just only report things that are positive, and they don't really present the overall picture of how of what the DNA is saying. So if you can't twist the science too much, the only other thing you can twist is scripture. And so the apologists have twisted the Book of Mormon narrative as much as they can to accommodate the science. And this is why you have this. The limited geography now is just basically a tiny group of people that mixed with the Mayans, dominated their civilization for 1,000 years, and cleared off. And that is just, and Rodney saw this, and he's just shocked. So the DNA he's convinced the DNA isn't a problem because the Book of Mormon is true, and he comes along and he sees the limited geography, and it's
ridiculous.
It's absolutely shocking. It's absolutely spiritually ridiculous. And so that's when he jumped on the X2 DNA because it was. He saw one or two research papers when they were a little bit less clear about it, but there are papers from 2000, published in the year 2000, looked in detail at the X lineage. There's a whole paper on it. So the scientists knew exactly what was going on. They knew that the lineage wasn't present in Asia. But scientists, including Ugo Perego, have subsequently looked at many X2A lineages in the Americas and determined that it arrived just at the same time as all the other lineages. So it was never really in doubt. But once he latched onto it, he has not shifted. And so he's...
and what are Rodney Meldrum's qualifications? Do we know?
I think he did a marketing degree at Utah State University for about a year. But after that, he was involved he had his own company. I think it was High Country Soups or Foods or something. And for a number of years. Okay. And then
so
I think Y2K sank it because they they had huge orders because preppers were collecting their soup, their dried soups, and Y2K didn't turn into the catastrophe where everyone was expecting, and it went under. And it was not long after then that he worked for about 6 or 7 years with Dean Sessions as his senior research director or manager. And that was basically photocopying hundreds or thousands of research papers.
Yeah, his biography from the Firm Foundation mentions no formal education at all. It just talks about his work as working on these books. And president and CEO of High Country Gourmet. And
that's the one.
Development for a medical learning management system, but nothing about actual education. I should add that I talked to Rodney before the airing of this show. We have invited him to come on Mormon Stories podcast. He said that he might do a response to this, but he declined to come on today's show. And I asked him about the finances and his income, and I'll mention that later. But
okay,
yeah. Anyway, to answer your question, doesn't sound like he has any scientific education.
No, but he presents. For years he has presented himself as a lead scientific researcher on a scientific textbook. He never mentioned it was the universal model until about 4 or 5 years ago. So he went for about a decade presenting himself as a lead researcher on a scientific textbook.
And let me just try to restate what you said, and correct me if I'm wrong, but if I understood correctly, you're saying Ugo Perego looked at these X lineage or DNA stuff, and he concluded that there was nothing there. There was nothing that would support the Book of Mormon. Pretty much, it was just confirming what scientists have always thought. And then Rodney Meldrum looked at the same evidence, but then he concluded the opposite and said, no, actually, this X lineage DNA thing actually supports the Book of Mormon. And Ugo Perego is wrong, and everyone else is wrong, and I got it right. Is that kind of what's happening?
Yeah, I mean, let's be clear about this. Ugo Perego has published more X2A DNA research than any other scientist.
Okay.
So he is, let's
just publish the work. He's done the research.
He is a scientist, right? Ugo Perego is a scientist, right?
Yes.
Yeah, he's a scientist.
He's a big scientist. Like he has pretty big qualifications. And I think he was pretty involved with the gospel topic essay about DNA on the Book of Mormon.
Yeah, that's the other point, that if we want to know which side the church chose, we know they chose Ugo to write their DNA in the Book of Mormon essay that was published by the church. That shows what side the church is on, which is the Mesoamerican. Yeah,
but they're a little bit off the rails. According to Rodney, they're a bit off the rails at the moment. They're misled by the science.
Yeah.
But look, it's he landed in very fertile ground because not only was there Dean Sessions, providing the groundwork for this, he very soon linked up with Wayne May, and Wayne May publishes a magazine called Ancient American since about 1993, and basically his magazine features an awful lot of his magazine is devoted to proving that Europeans reached the Americas hundreds of years before Christ. And in fact, if you look at the dates that he often puts up in his presentations, it aligns perfectly with the Book of Mormon period. So there are many Americans over the last couple of hundred years have been highly motivated to find evidence to place, to create fraudulent evidence that the French or the Jews or Assyrians or somebody got to America, because it's all exciting stuff. It's sort of conspiracy theory sort of stuff. And so a lot of a lot of people have created fakes. A very famous collection of fakes is the Michigan relics. And this is a large number of fake engravings on slate and in copper and stone that were planted in places all over about 7 or 8 counties in Michigan. And they were the church. Some church members were really taken by these because they supported the Book of Mormon. And eventually, James E. Talmage was sent to participate in one of the digs. He went over there and he found they found some of these, and he declared them a fake back then. And then several decades after him, Milton Hunter, a general authority of the church, purchased these, and they were brought to Salt Lake. I'm not sure where they were kept, either at BYU or somewhere. So these Michigan relics were purchased by the church, and he promoted these for years. And then after he died, they sort of sat there on shelves for a number of years. And then a couple of academics looked at them and they were found to be frauds again, 100 years later.
Yeah.
And they donated them to the Michigan Historical Society. So now these relics are all on display in Michigan. But Wayne May is convinced that some of these relics are real.
Yeah.
So when you have a really big hotspot of fakes, Michigan is famous for them. To then say, oh, well, some of them are real, it's, they've been universal. Like the fraud is that obvious that scientists have matched the slate. Okay, they've matched it to particular quarries that are adjacent in the area. So quarries that have been developed in the last, in historic time, in our time, since Europeans have arrived in the Americas. So they've matched the thickness and the variety of the slate to the Michigan quarries nearby. The copper is modern copper, that sort of thing. So there's such obvious fakes that even, anyone that's sort of remotely unbiased will see that, yes, these are frauds.
Right.
But many of these they're convinced. Rodney and his group are convinced. So he linked up with Wayne May, but he's also hooked up with Digital Legend Press, which is owned by Boyd Tuttle, and other LDS scholars who I think, or pseudo scholars, that have very deep pockets, and they've produced these amazing documentaries. That documentary that you referred to earlier on, The Lost Civilizations of North America, this was produced in 2010. And they got all these scientists excited about this, and they interviewed them all. Brad Lepper and Deborah Bolnick, some very famous scientists that have worked on the woodland cultures in North America. And they interviewed them all, and then they went away and produced this documentary. So I think this was clearly a case of false pretenses. They'd set these scientists up thinking that they were, that Digital Legend was, the producing company was genuinely interested in the true story of the ancestry of these people.
Yeah.
But then they misquoted them. They took them out of context. And they were so upset, the scientists were so upset, they published 3 rebuttals and complaints about and I've got the links on the website where you can find these complaints.
Yeah.
But
do you want to go to the next slide, John? Because I think we're about to get to that slide where he has one of the rebuttals from the scientists.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is kind of like what.
Yeah, well, this is to me is, as a scientist, I find this really quite offensive. To be claiming that scientists who have devoted their careers to studying the archaeological remains of North American Indians, to claim that they're trying to hide how advanced they were, and to claim that these scientists are deceitful, these deceitful archaeologists.
Simon, let's read the quote just for people
Yeah.
to see the slide.
Okay, this is a quote from Rodney Meldrum that's currently on his Firm Foundation annotated Book of Mormon blog, which I accessed yesterday. Quote, "They hid the story of the Native Americans as being a wonderful spiritual people who are far more advanced than intellectuals want to tell us. Anything that doesn't fit the current reality of these deceitful archaeologists, they declare as a hoax or fake."
So it's this conspiracy mindset that
It's
somehow
the conspiracy mindset.
community
Yeah.
wants to hide from us that Native Americans were spiritual, or whatever they need to, whatever Meldrum wants us to believe about Native Americans being Book of Mormon like. He says there's a conspiracy in the scientific community to hide any evidence that North American Native Americans were Book of Mormon like, right?
All of the scientists there have done a Bachelor of Science at university. They've done a PhD. So they have spent probably a decade of their life dedicated to their field, and they're working because they love finding the truth. And to accuse them of hiding the truth, to accuse them of being deceitful, it's just ridiculous. It's just utterly ridiculous, and it's offensive. And Meldrum ought to take this off his website. And they need to, but this is a common theme. I was just watching a video that Wayne May produced. Jonathan Neville, a whole lot of them. They're always referring to the scientists as dishonest and hiding the true history of the woodland cultures, the Adena and the Hopewell, in order to hide how impressive they were. And I mean, it's also incredibly racist, really. They're essentially claiming, because this is going back to the Moundbuilder myth. They're essentially claiming that scientists are hiding the presence of Jews who had migrated to America and inspired these earthworks. That's what they're claiming.
Yeah.
And what's racist about that? What's racist about that?
They're claiming that in order to build those amazing structures, they needed the input of Europeans. They needed Jewish people to come over there and inspire them, just like
white people. With any
John
white
Sorensen claims in Mesoamerica with the mines. John Sorensen and BYU and the farms crowd. It's racist to claim that Jews were necessary to inspire the mine culture to come to flourish and become so amazing.
And that's what the Moundbuilder myth was claiming in the 1700s.
If you go to the next slide, actually, John, that's part of the next one after that. We'll go back to that one. That's the response from these scientists who from what I understand, Simon, they're not Mormon, right?
No.
What is this article?
So this is the response, because Simon was talking about the DVD and the video that Rodney Meldrum produced and about this evidence, and he brought in these 4 scientists who had spent several years of their career studying this stuff, and he brought them on.
They're experts on the North American woodland cultures.
Right.
And they were all interviewed for the DVD. There were many other scientists who were upset, but they didn't. They probably chose not to put their name to this because, the scientific community, there's lots of Mormons in the scientific community, and quite a lot of scientists are concerned about what impact that might have on their career. You never know who's going to review your next grant application, that sort of thing. So they felt so badly about how they'd been misportrayed that they published 3 rebuttals.
Yeah, and that the information they shared was used to support a false claim. That's
Yeah,
pretty much what they're
yeah.
saying. But right now that we're talking about this racist claim of the Moundbuilder myth and all that stuff, if you read the conclusion, John, can you read that? You
Yeah.
probably have it bigger.
Yeah, I can. In the past, many scholars have pointed to a sometimes explicitly racist agenda behind the claims of diffusionists who argue that the glories of Native American civilizations were achieved only through borrowing from various old world groups. The producers of The Lost Civilizations of North America, that's Rodney Meldrum's DVD, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the diffusionists they feature in their documentary turn this argument on its head by suggesting that it is instead those mainstream scholars who are the real racists because they deny Native Americans their role in an already globalized world of the early centuries of the Common Era. However, the only support for this picture of Native American old world interactions 2,000 years ago comes from resurrected frauds and distorted history. There's no credible archaeological or genetic evidence to suggest that any old world peoples migrated to the Americas after the initial incursion from Siberia prior to the tentative forays of the Norse beginning around 1000 CE, which is after, after Christ, basically, other than limited contacts between Siberia and the American Arctic.
Yeah.
And
So
it also says DNA science apparently settles. No. I'll stop there. Okay, go ahead. Keep going, guys.
Yeah, it's super interesting that they even acknowledge that this like racist idea, right? That Native Americans couldn't have built these civilizations or done this stuff without borrowing from the old world.
Yeah. John Sorensen, a professor of anthropology at BYU, was a diffusionist. Okay, and so that underlies, and diffusionism is racism when it's
again,
referring to Native Americans and Polynesians.
Tell us one more time what diffusionism is.
It's the idea that pretty much all of the major advances in civilization stem from ideas that were developed in the Middle East, basically the cradle of civilization. And, you couldn't have a pyramid in that had to be a link between the American pyramids and the pyramid of Egypt, which is actually a fairly simple thing if you build a four-walled structure. Three-walled structure is pretty complicated. Four-walled structures, and you want to build it tall, it tends to turn into a pyramid, doesn't it? So it's that sort of idea, and that's pervasive throughout all of the. Mormon's Codex by John Sorensen is basically diffusionism writ large in a huge book, and it's been roundly rejected by modern science.
Right.
But if we get back to Rodney, this particular DVD that they produced, if you go back, stay with that slide. That DVD that they've produced would have been incredibly popular. They would have made an awful lot of money out of it. But somebody had to finance the production of that DVD. It was very professionally done, that Lost Civilizations of North America documentary, aired on TV. So somebody's paying for that. So somebody's got deep pockets. And they've even got enough money to buy land and do archaeological digs. So now these people, now the Heartland group are involved in doing LiDAR. As we speak, they're doing LiDAR surveys of land around where they think the Temple of Zarahemla is, and this is a dig on the opposite side of the Mississippi River from Nauvoo. So they had LiDAR images that suggested there was something underground. They went and purchased 13.7 acres of land from a farmer, $300,000 they shelled out for the land. They went out there with buckets and spades. Looked like a regular archaeological dig, and they just dug deeper and deeper and deeper. And then towards the end of the day, second day, I think they brought in the bulldozers because they hadn't found anything. The biggest concern I have with this is...
What were they hoping to find, Simon?
Well, I think they had LiDAR images that suggested there might be a wall down there. They're hoping to find a wall of the Temple of Zarahemla. Now, it's not surprising that it's deep sand there because you got the Mississippi River a couple of hundred yards away. And, you know, prior to European settlement, there would have been some pretty massive floods probably every year. So it's probably extremely deep sand. And
what our listeners don't see are these photos of these kind of pasty white middle-aged dudes with hats, with these red and yellow and blue buckets, with shovels digging large holes. It's almost reminding me of what Joseph Smith would have been doing, treasure digging with his own white middle-aged friends, you know, in New York back in the 1820s. But then they've got photos of bulldozers trying to dig, and it's just inexplicable. They're spending a third of $1,000,000 trying to dig for Zarahemla, somewhere around.
Well, it's probably, I would say, close to $500,000 would have been spent easily.
To because try and dig for Zarahemla.
They've got to pay for the LiDAR. They've, you know, planes flying over, all sorts of things.
Do we? When the African?
What do you call that hat? That
hard hat?
Yeah, it's a name for
the safari hat, like a safari hat.
It's a safari hat. That's Wayne May, and he's using dowsing rods.
Oh my gosh, are you kidding me?
Find something. And I don't know who the other individual is, but another guy over there's got a metal detector, and he's going along the wall of the hole trying to find some sort of metal objects. I mean, if you do it, I'm surprised they didn't find anything because they buried it all over, and it all went. All of this was taken. These photos were taken, were published on the Heartland website, and an archaeologist named Andy White collected all of these images, and he's got it stored on his web. He's got a blog, and he looks at pseudo-archaeology that's going. A lot of this stuff happens. People out there digging to find things, and he's published it, and so we've got a very clear record of what went on. And they actually filled in the site and moved on, and they took all the images from their webpage. But he's quite concerned, and I'm equally concerned because, you know, what if they do LiDAR and they find a genuinely interesting archaeological remains, and then they go in with a team with bulldozers and backhoes with no training. So they'll just destroy. They'll destroy very valuable.
Is this still going on, Simon? Like, are they still digging there?
Well, a couple of years ago, I know they had a webpage where they were raising money for more of these sorts of things.
Did they find anything?
If you dig a hole in, I don't know if they found anything in this particular dig. It looks very clean to me. It looks like a child's play sandpit. But I think if you do LiDAR over very fertile ground like around the Mississippi River, because Native Americans have been living there for 15,000 years, you're going to find because every time somebody builds a campfire and the charcoal survives, burnt charcoal survives very long periods of time. So when that gets buried, if you do LiDAR, you actually see hundreds and hundreds of these little spots from where there's been a fire in the soil. So it can pick up that sort of stuff. So, you know, if they look long enough, they're going to find the remains of a palisaded fort or something. And just like they have done with the X2A, they'll find, this is amazing evidence for the Book of Mormon's here, because the Native Americans have lived there for 15,000 years. They have left signs of their civilizations or campfires behind.
Right. This photo reminds me of the documentary Behind the Curve, which is a documentary about modern flat earthers. And there's this point in the documentary where they set up these lasers like multi miles apart
Oh, yeah, another one you want.
to try and demonstrate that there's no curvature, on the Earth, because if you set up the lasers in just the right way and the beams connect, then you can show that there's no curvature on the Earth, and thus the Earth is flat. And this is like the climax of the documentary. Kind of spoil alert: the lasers show that there's a curve in the Earth, and all these flat earthers are looking at each other, and they're like, well, how do we explain these results?
Yeah, I'll get back to you. I saw that. I love that documentary. This does not compute. It's because they've got a fixed conclusion in their mind, and it's like it just blurs out any evidence that will challenge it.
Simon, I just have to also tell the story, and I don't mean to politicize this, but I'm talking about medical issues, not political issues.
Yeah.
I have some friends that are emergency room doctors, and they are seeing COVID patients come in to ER rooms in the United States, and these COVID patients are being admitted to intensive care units because they're dying, and they're needing to get intubated, and their oxygen levels are super low. And these are 99% of these people dying of COVID are chose not to get the vaccine. And when they come to the hospital to say, "Doctor, help me, I'm dying," and the doctor says, "Okay, let me do a test to find out why you're dying," and then the doctor comes back with the test and says, "You have COVID, you're dying," the patients that are dying get mad at the doctors and say, "You're lying. I don't have COVID, and you are being paid by big pharma and other governmental interests to tell me I have COVID when I have to be dying of something else other than COVID."
It's sort of really the same sort of thing.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
Yeah. So if we go to the next slide, might skip that one.
Skip this one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So if there was ever to be devised a very mean test for the Heartland theory, if there was ever any conniving Native American from the past who wanted to,
if Satan
really
wanted
mess with
to
them.
plant evidence,
Kennewick Man was a very, very naughty man. He's created a very difficult problem. He was discovered in 1996. Look, it's a very interesting story, and I'll just tell you a little bit of the backstory. His skeleton washed out of the banks of the Columbia River in Kennewick. Now, Kennewick, turns out it's an extremely dry part of Washington State. It gets hardly any rainfall. It's almost more of a desert than most of Australia. And so it was very good for preserving skeletons. And most of his skeleton washed out of, in fact, all of it washed out of the banks. And it was reported, and they got a forensic guy, Jim Chatters, came down, and they collected up the bones. And when they looked at the skull, they could tell it was clearly an ancient skeleton. Largely, one of the things was that his teeth were worn down, just like usually most Paleo Indian skeletons are. Their teeth are very worn down. But the skeleton, at the time, was one of the the skull was one of the earliest Native American skeletons they'd found. And it looked more similar to the Ainu from Japan than it did to contemporary American Indians.
Mm.
So at the time, and in fact, it looked more European than Native Americans. Now, at the time, they didn't realize this, but over the last couple of decades, many, many other early skulls have been found, and they're all very similar. Okay, they all don't look identical or very the same as the current Native Americans. Now, this is because the skull would actually fit within the natural variation that's present in Native Americans, but it didn't look like it was the center of the bell curve, if you know what I mean. It was sort of a bit of an outlier but it was part of the what you would see in the distribution. But the problem that created was it looked like it was an earlier ancestor, from an earlier people that had colonized the Americas. And some people believed that this might have been a group that the Native Americans had wiped out. So it became very controversial. But the skeleton was so amazingly preserved that scientists were really keen to study it. It was the best preserved ancient skeleton that had ever been recovered in the Americas. So the scientific community was very, very keen to study this skeleton in its minutest detail, to learn as much as they could about the past, because an early radiocarbon date of a bone from the skeleton determined that he was about 8,500 to 9,000 years old. But the big problem that then occurred for the Heartland group is that when they sequenced Kennewick Man's genome, he had the X2A lineage. And it was an X2A lineage that was ancestral to all the other lineages. But just jumping back a bit, there was a pretty ugly legal battle for almost a decade because the normal procedure is that if an Indigenous skeleton is found, it's then reburied by the local Native Americans. The reason scientists were able to study it was because at the time they believed that it was a different culture, and so there was a very protracted and a fairly ugly legal battle, and there's a lot of bad feeling on both sides, on Indigenous, on First Nations people. I think if you were to ask Thomas Murphy, he would certainly he'd be able to tell you how bad that became, that bad blood between the two groups. But to cut a long story short, they got permission to study they won the court case. They got permission to study the skeleton. They did a detailed analysis, and when they discovered that it was closely related to Native Americans, they went back to procedure, and the skeleton was handed back, and it's now been reburied somewhere in an unknown location. But so Kennewick Man was studied intensively by a group of around about 50 scientists, and so it's two facts here are extremely challenging for the Heartland theory. One of those is that the skeleton is 9,000 years old, so it clearly predates the Book of Mormon period by about 5,000 or 6,000 years.
And how accurate
DNA?
Simon, I don't know, growing up in the church, I always heard this apologetic argument that carbon dating may not be 100% reliable. How much truth is that? Like, how confident we are that this skeleton is 9,000 years old?
Oh, that's just a nonsense. It's a myth.
Okay,
and
so we can be 100% confident that this is around 9,000-year-old skeleton. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm going to go through some of that data in a moment. There are annual, like carbon dating is cosmic radiation produces carbon-14 in the atmosphere at a very low level, and then it decays away over about 30 years. You know, there are some years when slightly more carbon-14 is produced, but generally it decays away at a fairly constant rate, and you can be very confident within probably a couple of 100 years of the age of the material, as long as you've removed contaminating things like, you know, a tree root grows through a piece of carbon from a fireplace. You know, if the tree root grows through 5,000 years after the carbon was laid down from the fire pit, it'll contaminate, that sort of thing. So scientists as long as they're very careful to remove contaminating evidence, it can be extremely accurate.
Okay. So you said problem number one for Heartlanders is that this is a 9,000-year-old skeleton.
Yeah, because because he's carrying the X2A DNA, that's
Mm.
when they really got bothered by Kennewick Man, because his age, that meant that's the strongest evidence that we have that the lineage was present in America before Lehi or the Jaredites or anyone arrived.
Right.
Before Adam and Eve lived on the earth.
Yeah, a few thousand years before that as well. Yeah. So we go to the next slide. So this was a problem that the Heartlanders had to address. They felt compelled to address. So on the left here is an illustration of a book published in 2014. The authors of that book are about 50 nationally recognised forensic anthropologists from a range of fields. The work was led by Professor Douglas Owsley, who's the head of anthropology at the Smithsonian Institute. And I mean, I've read a fair chunk of this book, and it's just incredible just the detailed work that was done and how thorough the scientists were. And it's a beautiful piece of work. They learned an incredible amount about Kennewick Man's from the bones. They could tell that he used, one interesting one was he had 2 depression fractures in his head, because back in Paleolithic Americans used to swing what's called a bowler, and it was a small stone in a sling, and they would sling it around their head. It was basically a couple of stones connected by probably a piece of leather or something. They swing it around their head, and they would throw it at birds, and it would swing around the bird's legs and capture a bird, and then they would eat the bird. Well, when he was inexperienced, he'd flung this around his head, and he'd clunked his head a couple of times with the bowler, and the stone had left a depression in his skull a couple of times. The way that his bones were worn, they could tell the way that he walked. They could tell that he carried a spear. They could tell he was which arm he threw the spear with from his bones. They could tell what diet they did. They do stable isotopes of oxygen and nitrogen. That enables them to tell what sort of food he ate. He ate salmon. They could also tell that he periodically experienced hunger. Okay, now if you're a Paleolithic American Indian, you're going to periodically experience hunger, particularly if you lived before before they learnt how to dry salmon. So in the Pacific Northwest, it was about 5,000 years ago, they figured out how to, because they had this enormous resource of food, but in a narrow window during the year. And so with Kennewick Man, they figured out that he lived prior to that, the drying of salmon, which enabled the First Nations people to have a steady source of food all the way through that period when fresh salmon wasn't available in the rivers. But there's just a whole pile of other things that they learned about Kennewick Man. So I don't know whether David Reed was assigned or whether he volunteered, but David Reed, who's a patent attorney, has written basically what amounts to a rebuttal of the Kennewick Man work done under the direction of the head of anthropology at the Smithsonian and 50 other scientists in the Americas. So this is sounding an awful lot like Dean Sessions, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's published. His work is published by Digital Legends Press. Okay, this Digital Legend Press is a LDS publisher.
Mormon non-scientist who takes on the entire global scientific community, basically.
Yes. Yeah. And he's got the clay molding of Kennewick Man on his front cover, taken directly from the Smithsonian Institute. And I take it from me, they're not very happy, but they had no way to control it because the Smithsonian has a policy of allowing the public in America and around the world to use their work as long as they just ignore it.
And that's his area of expertise too. He's an attorney, David Reed, so he can take it and know for sure he won't get in trouble.
Yeah. But I mean, I mean, yeah. So I actually learnt about David Reed's book because the publisher sent me an advanced copy
Oh.
for my comments, which they didn't listen to, and they also sent a copy to one of the scientists involved in the work, Jim Chatters, who actually collected the skeleton that was washed out of the river. So what I want to do now is just go through the science and point out, because we go to the next slide, these are the two major claims, because I'm not going to respond to every single claim that a Gish Galloper makes.
Yeah.
Go nowhere. There are two key claims.
And Simon, what are your
Claims-
credentials? What are your credentials, Simon? Just so we establish that.
I'm retired.
But I mean, your training.
Well, I have a degree in science, plant science from the University of Sydney, and PhD from the University of Sydney, and I led the scientific research at CSIRO for 15 years. So
And
forestry, molecular genetics.
oh,
So
you have a PhD in molecular genetics.
CSIRO is Australia's national science research body.
Okay, all right, just making sure. So you're not
Other than that,
not a
I'm a
patent attorney.
doofus. So his key claim is that Kennewick Man was 2,500 years old, which just by coincidentally fits perfectly with the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
And this is based on the calcium carbonate, which was associated with the skeleton. And he obviously claims that the other claim that he makes is not only that the X2A came from the Middle East, but he claims that it's only 4 mutations away from the Egyptian X2J mitochondrial lineage. Okay, so I'm going to address both of these claims in a little bit more detail because I think it's important for people to know. So let's look at the calcium carbonate claim.
Sorry to interrupt again, but is Rod Meldrum related, involved in these claims?
Would David Reed be presenting at one of Rodney Meldrum's conferences?
Yeah, David Reed just presented at Rodney Meldrum's Firm Foundation conference.
And he would sell his books there and all that. Yeah. Okay.
And you can buy his book for about $23.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, this slide's probably a bit out of order, but yeah, let's just to show you where Kennewick Man was located. There'd be some people outside of America wouldn't know where Washington is. So this is Washington State.
South Central Washington State.
Yeah, and this is a very, very, it's a very, very dry landscape. So essentially what he'd done is he would have been following the Columbia River, probably catching salmon, and then he died and was buried deliberately, it looks like, by the people that he was with. So we go to the next slide. So this is an outline of this is a photograph of the skeleton. As you can see, there's a large proportion of the bones are present, something like about 97% of the bones were present. Now, if you go to the full image of the slide, if you look very carefully, I've got my pointer, but you're not going to see it. But see at the end of the yellow arrow there, there's a little grey area. That is, in fact, a spear point that is lodged in Kennewick Man's pelvis. And you can see an image of the spear point expanded there. That spear point is common around about the 7,000 to 10,000 year ago period. It was common that long ago. So it's completely consistent with the radiocarbon dates for Kennewick Man. So he lived for potentially a decade or so with that spear point in his hip. He was very fortunate that it didn't appear to impact his walking. And that's because they could tell if it impacted his walking, like if he had a huge limp, that would have worn his bones in a different way. And they didn't find any evidence of that. So it's likely it was very painful. He pulled the spear out. It might have even been one that was accidental. But anyway, he pulled it out and lived the remainder of his life with the spear point in his hip. He probably would have known it was there, I guess, because the stone didn't come out. So you can see why they were so desperate to study the skeleton, because forensic scientists know how much you can learn about a skeleton by studying all of the bones.
Yeah.
So they did very, very detailed analysis of the bones. If you go on to the next slide. As I mentioned, the skeleton was washed out of the riverbank. So you needed forensic scientists to work out where the bones were located in the soil profile. And one thing they found was that there was calcium carbonate deposited in the soil at two different depths in the soil profile, one at around about 1 metre and one at about 1.5 metres. There were these calcium carbonate deposits in the soil. And because the skeleton was, the skeleton had calcium carbonate attached to it, and the soil grains matched the profile at about 1 metre down, they determined that's where the skeleton was buried. Also attached to the skeleton were products that degraded away from the Mazama ash. If you look, the Mazama ash layer is famous in the archaeological community, well known amongst archaeologists. It's an ash layer that at Kennewick was around about, I think about 12 inches deep, maybe 8 to 12 inches deep. And it's an ash layer from the Crater Lake volcanic eruption, which was known as Mount Mazama before it was blown up in the eruption that's now left Crater Lake in Oregon. And you can see the enormous ash layer that came from that eruption. And that happened about 7,000, the eruption took place about 7,700 years ago. And it's left this, what they refer to as the Mazama ash layer. And the scientists know that he was buried underneath the ash layer because of the carbonates. And they also know because the Mazama ash breaks down to a clay molecule called allophane, and there was allophane attached to the bones. So that conclusively proves the Kennewick Man was buried well before the Mazama eruption. Mm-hmm. And any calcium carbonate attached to those bones came from rainwater that came down the profile. If you've ever been in a cave underground and seen the wonderful stalactites and the stalagmites, that's calcium carbonate. That comes from rainwater, because rainwater carries carbon dioxide dissolved in it. In fact, rainwater is a very weak carbonic acid, and it percolates down through the soil. And in a situation like this, in a very dry location, like we have with Kennewick in Washington, you get a heavy dose of rain. It's very rare, but then it starts to evaporate. The calcium carbonate, the dissolved carbon dioxide is traveling down the soil. The evaporation at the surface then dries the soil out, and eventually it precipitates and forms hard calcium carbonate. And so this carbonate layer, which is the layer that David Reed has focused a lot of his attention on, is not derived from Kennewick Man. It's derived from the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that's washed down thousands of years after the body was buried and the soil accumulated over the top. So most of the soil that accumulated over the top of Kennewick Man was blown there. So it was just wind-blown dry sand that blew across what is almost effectively desert. And then very, very, very little of it was from flooding, because the Columbia River had eroded away a deeper channel and gone further away from the site. And so it was mostly wind-blown soil above the skeleton. So if we go on to the next slide. So scientists know all about carbonates, and they know the carbonates are not connected with Kennewick Man, but they just study them because they're interested in learning when the carbonates were deposited. So this is taken from the book published by Douglas Owsley and his co-authors. And you can see on the bottom, these yellow triangles, they're dates of the carbonates. And you can see in the picture on the right, the different places that the carbonates are found. You can see some on the outer layer of the bones, some on the very degraded bone at the top, and also inside the bones, there are these carbonates that have cemented together with the sand in there. And so because the scientists were interested in finding out when those carbonates formed, they carbon dated them. But if you look down the bottom of that bone sample, you can see there's some bone protein that they isolated. So they didn't just go and grind up the bone and do carbon date it. They purified collagen from the bone. The bones were that well preserved, the scientists were able to purify, and there are chemical processes for doing this, where you purify the protein, the collagen protein from the bone. So you remove all of the contaminating impurities. And if you look at all these blue diamonds at the top there, those are the collagen dates. Those are the only radiocarbon dates that relate to Kennewick Man. They're the only carbon dates, the only radiocarbon dates that relate to Kennewick Man. The carbonate dates are related to rainwater that occurred thousands of years after his burial. And that's what Kennewick Man, David Reed is claiming are the actual radiocarbon dates for Kennewick Man. If you go to the next slide, you know how I mentioned that.
Sorry, I mean, can I ask you a question to kind of summarize what
sure.
I think I just heard? That he's pulling that he's pulling the way that he arrives at the date 2500 or whatever.
Yeah.
Is by pulling by pulling the dates that tie to the sand, not the bone. Is that right?
Yes, it's rock. Carbonate is carbonate rock, and the carbonates are all formed with the interaction of sand with carbon dioxide dissolved in rainwater coming down through the profile. So it's completely unconnected with Kennewick Man. So
the material that allows him to date Kennewick Man to conveniently 2500 BC,
yes,
or 2500 years ago, comes from the rock, not the bone.
Yeah,
comes from rock found near the bone, not the actual bone.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure we summarized in a way that people like me could understand it. But if you actually went to the bone, it would be 8,000 years ago, not 2,300. Yeah.
But it's so clear because the fact that they're able to purify collagen. Okay, you can't get protein or collagen from rock unless it comes from a human. That's the only human connection. It's a completely direct connection to a human.
So
they've got protein. Once they've got protein, if you go back to that image, you'll see that there are two red dots there that are in between. And the scientists that did that was the National Park Service. They did 4 measurements, and they even acknowledged that they didn't get very good quality collagen. Okay, so if you don't get good quality collagen, you're going to get a not very good quality radiocarbon estimate of the age. But they're still very old. They still predate Book of Mormon periods. But when the scientists that did the very detailed and the most meticulous study, those blue dates, they've all purified and they've got outstanding yields of collagen protein. And the only source of that protein is Kennewick Man. So you then have a direct link to Kennewick Man. And so when you radiocarbon date the protein, which has carbon in it, that tells you very precisely how how long ago Kennewick Man was buried. And the average of those, that's about a dozen dates, is very, very close to the very, very first measurement that was done. And that's that orange triangle on the top left. The green circle is the average of what they believe to be the most accurate measurements, based probably on the outstanding.
We have a viewer.
Or something like that.
Simon, we have a viewer wondering if maybe the rocks got collagen injections or collagen implants, and that might. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just being silly.
No.
Thank you, Tom. Okay, so the emails. So I guess some scientists didn't like David Reed's interpretation.
Yeah, well, this is where I get pretty annoyed because I was sent a copy of the book. Then I discovered afterwards that Jim Chatters, one of the scientists who picked up the bones from the Columbia River, intimately involved in the science. And he reads David Reed's book and he says, the 2,000-year dates you cling to are actually dates on soil carbonate, which deposits continuously from water percolating down from the surface. They are not dates on the skeleton at all.
That's pretty clear.
An email from the scientist who did the work to David Reed on June the 10th, 2020. Further correspondence, he noticed that David Reed isn't paying attention. In the next email on the 12th of June, this is what the scientist says. Bottom line, the carbonate dates from Cayman's bone are not reliable. There was really no research reason to do them. The reliable radiocarbon age of Cayman, based on both the projectile point in his pelvis and the protein in his bones, is around 8,400 years before present. Okay. Okay. David Reed is an adult. In my view, he's lying. To go ahead and publish a book claiming that the carbonate dates are linked to Kennewick Man after a scientist has repeatedly pointed out to you, and then to go and continue to publish your stuff, that's lying. This is fraud.
And we know he saw the emails, correct? That's what you were saying?
I know he saw the emails because he corresponded backwards and forwards with Jim Chatters.
Right.
There's no doubt. And his publisher, Boyd Tuttle at Digital Legend Press, has seen these because I sent them to him. And he's also heard me explain why the carbonate dates are not Kennewick Man.
Yeah.
You can imagine how the scientists feel about this sort of rubbish. Anyway.
So there's thousands and thousands and thousands of Mormons all along the Wasatch Front and elsewhere who desperately need the Book of Mormon to be true, but they're smart enough to know that the Mesoamerican limited geography theory doesn't hold water because even Joseph Smith didn't believe it. And so they're willing to cling to shoddy pseudoscientists who make fraudulent interpretations. And Rodney Meldrum and David Reed and all these other people just happen to kind of make a living off of advancing the pseudoscience and misleading thousands and thousands and thousands of Mormons into kind of conspiracy theories that also betray our most fundamental understandings of the foundations of the earth as science is now describing it to us, right? Yeah.
So I think we might be moving on to DNA.
Yeah.
So if you expand that, I mean, we'll probably talk about the whole movement generally towards the end here, but I wanted to sort of delve into his X2A lineage claims as well, because they're just as fraudulent.
Simon, sorry, we've got a comment in. This is Boyd Tuttle writes, David Reed addressed each one of the concerns raised by you and other critics in the appendix of the book. Why don't you discuss those in your presentation, Simon?
I haven't seen them.
All
I
right.
haven't seen the appendix.
Okay, so Boyd, your job is to get Simon and me the appendix of which you speak. I'm at mormonstories@gmail.com, and we'll have Simon. I don't know how Simon, how did David Reed hear your critiques and address them in an appendix.
Before he read the before.
It's like, Simon, have you made these critiques elsewhere where they would have?
No, I haven't seen the appendix.
No, but have you made these critiques you're making to us? Have
Yeah.
you made them
I sent them
elsewhere?
to Boyd Tuttle
Okay.
and to David Reed.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So David Reed, get us and Simon the appendix, and
let's remind Boyd that those critics that he's calling critics are the actual scientists who actually handled the bones.
I will confess up front, I'm just going to be very hard to find the energy to respond to a bunch of gish gallopers who are just going to throw out all of these dubious claims. Boyd needs to explain how 50 of America's leading forensic archaeologists were completely fooled, and a patent attorney, David Reed. Okay, I'm appealing to authority, but
you're appealing to the scientific method and the scientific community
and the people who held the bones, right?
Yeah.
Well,
when we move on to the DNA, I don't think because David Reed has made various claims in the past. One point he claimed that it was only one mutation away from Kennewick Man and this Egyptian lineage, but he corrected that. But let's look at his claim. David Reed claims that there are 4 mutations that are different between Kennewick Man and an Egyptian X2J lineage. The mistake that he makes is that he assumes that the Egyptian lineage that he's comparing to Kennewick Man is the ancestral lineage. There are 4 mutations that are different between Kennewick Man and an ancestral lineage, but there are 6 mutation differences between the Egyptian lineage that he's actually talking about and the ancestral lineage. So there are not 4 mutations that are different between Kennewick Man and the Egyptian X2J. There are 10 mutations that are different. Okay, so I should just run through what this slide shows. It's basically a pedigree chart of Native American X2A lineages. And each lineage has new mutations that are unique to it, and they descend from previous lineages, and they all go back to Kennewick Man. So they're all descendants of Kennewick Man's X2A lineage. Now, on average, the number of different new mutations in American Indians compared to the Egyptian X2 lineage, the number of mutations is around about 19 to 20 extra mutations in X2A lineages in American Indians. So it's not the 4 that he's talking about. So he's completely wrong.
Right.
And
he just doesn't understand a mitochondrial tree. Okay, the ancestral X, what they refer to as the X2AJ lineage, has not been found in a living individual. That's the lineage that David Reed is comparing Kennewick Man to. The only lineage X2J lineage that's been found is in a living Egyptian, and it's 10 mutations away from Kennewick Man. So
what's the difference between 4 and 10? What's the difference between 4 and 10 mutations?
Well, the more mutations there are, the longer into the past if you just take 2 lineages, if there's only 1 mutation different, then that probably suggests they share a common ancestor within the last 500 to maybe 1,000 years or a couple of thousand years. If it's 4 mutations, then it's probably 4,000 to 5,000 years. If it's 10, it's more like roughly 10 to 15,000 years. Right? So
yeah,
Kennewick Man and the Egyptian probably have an ancestor around about 20 to 25, maybe 30,000 years ago.
And
But
again, by these own people's own admission, the Earth's only 7,000 years old.
Yeah.
So it's ridiculous.
So
Wait.
his claims are just patently false. He just doesn't understand it.
Yeah.
As you can see here, we've got somebody who is an author on one of the papers in the Owsley Jantz book. Oh, I'm explaining it well. Thank you, Tim. I mean, it's a fantastic book if you're interested in human forensics and how painstaking these folk are. You can purchase the ebook. I'm happy to do a promo for the ebook. It's about 600 pages in length, but they just detail the whole story really nicely, including the complicated legal battle. It was very tough and some very hurt feelings on both sides of the story. But I can speak with some authority on the X2A lineage because of my background in genetics, and I can assure you that Ugo Perego would agree with everything that I've said.
Yeah.
And he knows a heck of a lot more about X2 DNA than I do in having done work on handled samples. So there's no doubt he's just completely wrong. So if we click onto the next slide, this is actually some work that published by Ugo Perego. This is the guy that wrote the church's DNA essay. So he just took a whole pile of X2A lineages, as well as all of the other 4 lineages in the Americas. And within each lineage, you can look at how much diversity there is, how many mutations they are, and they can estimate how long ago those, how long those lineages have been present in the New World. And Ugo Perego's estimate for the X2A is 17,000 years ago, that it's been a group, a sort of a lineage cluster in the Americas. And there are 4 other, the 4 other lineages, mitochondrial lineages present in American Indians have similar ages: 15,000, 17,000, 16,300, 16,500. And Perego's work was validated by another group of scientists that looked at similar data and coming up with similar ages for how long the X2A lineage has been present in the Americas.
Wow. Yeah, and this is a question just to clarify. So originally, before the DNA tests were done on the Kennewick Man, Rodney Meldrum was relying on this X2 lineage to be the people of the Book of Mormon, correct?
Yes, he's been very clear about that. The X2A lineage came from the Middle East.
And then because of the evidence that studying the Kennewick Man brought forth, well, that tells us that lineage has been here for way longer than any of the Book of Mormon people were supposed to be here. Okay, that makes sense.
Not longer than
he was not even interested in Kennewick. Sorry, John. He wasn't even interested in Kennewick Man until the DNA was published. So that was 2015. Boom.
Right.
But
he's still claiming it, right? He's still claiming that
because he thinks
X2A is Lehi, pretty much.
Yeah, and I think to understand this, you've got to, and this is what really irritates the BYU apologists, is Rodney, right from the outset, has claimed that he's basically on a mission from God. He had a blessing from Hartman Rector Jr., a former apostle, a former general authority.
Yeah.
And I can only guess what was in that blessing, but, in an email to people who were his supporters, he clearly outlined that he's basically, God has revealed it through this blessing that he is to do this Heartland work. Yeah. And that has really, really irritated the Mormon apologists because That's sort of rule number one. You don't claim that the spirit is telling you that this piece of evidence fits here or whatever, because who has the church has even come out and said they don't have a position on geography.
Right.
So, Rodney Meldrum is essentially claiming that God has revealed the geography to him. So,
right. And I think that's what
he just
FairMormon
views that as evidence in
Yep.
the same way that he views archaeological evidence.
Yep.
So look, I'll have a brief look at the appendix if Boyd Tuttle's happy to send it to me. I'm not going to purchase the book. But this is just going to be a rabbit hole. I'll go down it and there'll be just false claim after dodgy claim after nonsense claim. It'll just go on and on and on forever, because the facts that we've just discussed don't have any impact because they don't fit. So you ignore them or you just work your way around them.
I want to end by talking about my exchange. I had a brief exchange with Rod I want to share, but there's a couple more slides. Can we finish the slides and then come back to my conversation with Rodney Meldrum and why all this matters? Is that okay, Simon?
Yeah, sure. I've only got a couple more, I think.
Okay,
So
yeah.
we go to the next slide. This is just to show that they've also sequenced I think they got a fairly good coverage of Kennewick Man's entire genome. And then they can do a comparison. So they've isolated DNA from a large number of populations around the world. And over on the right here, you see I don't know if you can see my pointer, but on the right there, you can see what sort of a scale. So if the circle is a red color, that indicates the genome has a lot of similarity. If the circle is yellow or greenish, it's sort of a little bit of similarity. And if you get blue, there's virtually no similarity or very low similarity. And you can see there's a green square out in the Pacific, so they compared Polynesians, and because they have common ancestry with American Indians, there's a little bit of green color there. But when you look at Europeans, and they'd be more closely related to Middle Eastern populations than they would be to American Indians, and they don't see there's hardly any relationship. So that just confirms all the other stuff that we know. But if we go to the next slide, this just sort of summarizes the data that we now know on Kennewick Man. And these are facts, okay? We know Kennewick Man is around about 9,000 years old. Okay, bone collagen is the gold standard for dating skeletons. And 12 dates, okay, all around about 9,000 years. So that's definitely the age. The spear point backs it up completely. It's around about the right age, Kennewick Man. Okay, I'm pretty sure that David Reed's got an explanation for why a 7,000-year-old spear point is in Kennewick Man's hip, but yeah, I'm not really interested. His genome's closely related to local Native Americans. His X2A lineage is ancestral to all Native Americans, X2As. And as mentioned before, he was a hunter-gatherer. So he clearly lived before 5,000 years ago when they started harvesting and storing salmon to give you that constant year-round food supply. So
yep.
That's pretty much, so that's my last slide. So, I think in my view, it's clearly an open shut case, really, when it comes to Kennewick Man and the Heartland theory.
So let me ask you now, Simon, so the first question is, what do we think the motive is of Rodney Meldrum and all of these pseudoscientists? I think we've kind of touched on it, but I want to kind of hit it directly. And then I want to ask, what does it matter? How is it harming anyone? Because you're a smart guy. There's a lot of things you could be doing. This program, feels like we want to spend our time in important ways. A few thousand or whatever, 10,000 people in Utah County that kind of lean towards conspiracy theorists. One could argue, who really cares? So my first question is, why do we think these pseudoscientists and Rodney Meldrum and all these Heartland theory people, what fuels them is my first question. And I think we answered it, but Simon, what do you think fuels them? Why are they doing all this shoddy pseudoscience? Is it because they're desperate to save the Book of Mormon?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, they've been fed in the churches, in the meetings that they've attended, and throughout their lives, they've been fed a very fundamentalist view of the world, distrust of science, and they've just bought into this young earth creationism. And this is I think that you'd find there'd be plenty of scientists at BYU also very disturbed about this. Because this is this isn't a minor operation now. This just completely swamps FAIR and what's going on in the apologetic arena.
You're saying it's big.
It's big. Huge. I mean, he's got that DVD. This was 10 years ago. He sold in 2 years 80,000 copies of his DVD.
So there's a lot of money involved, you're saying.
A lot of money involved. Oh, look, if they wanted to make money, yeah, you'd do the same thing.
But they probably didn't start wanting to make money. They probably started wanting to save the Book of Mormon and the Mormon worldview, and as you say, the young earth worldview that Joseph Smith, enshrined in the Book of Mormon and the Pearl of Great Price and in the Doctrine and Covenants. Joseph Smith kind of stuck us, and the Bible, frankly, stuck us with a young earth, creationist view. And so basically these Heartland theory people are trying to save the Bible, save Mormonism, save Joseph Smith, save the Book of Mormon from these these baddie scientists that are trying to kill faith. Is that kind of what they're doing?
Yeah, I think so. But I think it's a considerable concern for the church, because there are many Christian churches around the earth that don't embrace young earth creationism. Because it's just completely, it's pseudoscience.
And again, without getting too political, if you look at the way America is even struggling these days, there's a real problem with people trusting credible sources and trusting evidence. There's almost an epidemic in America right now of a large group of people that don't respect science and that don't respect data, don't respect evidence. And it's causing a lot of pain and suffering. And so this kind of Heartland theory type conspiracy theory devaluation of science is contributing to, on a Mormon scale, this larger national problem of distrusting science and evidence to the peril of some would even say, of our democracy. Is that do you think I'm stretching that too far, Simon?
Well, I think you're probably in a better position, but I have observed from a safe distance what's going on in America. But yeah, look, I think we're in a fake news era, post-truth era, if you like. And this stuff, I mean, I can't see it stopping. I think it's just going to continue to flourish. But it's much healthier for leaders to face, like the Catholic Church has done this, the Church of England's done this, many other churches tolerate, a wide range of views, and they very supportive of evolutionary science. But when you teach fundamentalism for so many years, it's very, very difficult for people to cope, particularly when they see the scientists at the church's own university following, what they view as just completely evil ideas.
To quote,
and as you say, it's very dangerous, for the church. I mean, it's no surprise that when the prophet came out and said, "Look, everyone should get vaccinated because the science is good and we can trust them," needs to be in a louder, booming voice. But he's undermining himself because he undermines evolution, which is a fact. It's one of the most firmly verified fact in modern science. And there are many, many Mormons who fully accept evolution, and it must be very, very disconcerting to see them, for them to see this idea flourishing. But,
yeah. So there's a comment from a listener that says, in my opinion, the reason that Rodney Meldrum has pushed the Heartland theory, and let's just say it's not just Rodney Meldrum, it's all his donors. It's all of the people who buy the books and attend the conferences. It's thousands and thousands and thousands of Mormons along the Wasatch Front and elsewhere. They've all pushed the Heartland theory so intently because it's so obvious that the Central American theory of the Book of Mormon, or the small geography theory, the limited geography theory, is completely untenable. Because we didn't even mention, how did Moroni walk from Central America to Palmyra, New York to bury the plates if the plates were, what, 130, 140 pounds?
50 to 40, I think.
I think 60 pounds.
Yeah.
What's that?
It's around 50, I think.
Okay, 50 or
I think
60
it's about
pounds.
60 pounds, but you've got all the other records too, and the Urim and Thummim.
Yeah, it just makes no sense. I'm going to read you guys a correspondence I had with Rodney. So I said, hey, Rodney, this is John. I left you a message, and he gets back with me. And so I asked him, is Firm Foundation a nonprofit or a for-profit? And he wrote, here's what he wrote. Since the onset, I determined to fund the research myself rather than solicit money from others. My accountant recommended I set it up as an S Corp. If the time comes that I need to get funding from others, I may convert it to a 501c3 nonprofit. There are CEOs of nonprofits that make millions of dollars, and there are CEOs of for-profit companies that make practically nothing. I have been blessed to make enough money to cover my needs, but not nearly as much as some have speculated. And so I followed up and I said, thank you, Rod. And then I said, have you been public about your annual income by chance? And he wrote, no. But for many years, my adjusted income was well below poverty level, less than $30,000 a year. Although that's not the case now, it was the case for many years as we got started. I have lived on what many would consider a meager income and put any extra money back into the project. I have spent nearly $200,000 on the creation of our streaming website over the past 2 years, all without soliciting money from others, but rather paying for it personally. You would wonder where he got $200,000 to spend. And then I concluded, thank you, Rod. Is there a reason you won't share your annual income now? And I haven't heard back from him in response to that text. So it sounds like he's doing very well now, but it's a for-profit, so we'll never know.
Yeah, look, I to be fair, I don't know that it's necessarily money that's driving him. I think it's probably this sort of absolute fundamentalist mindset. I can't comprehend how, well, I can understand how people would go down that path because that's what aligns with everything that they've heard at church from their leaders for decades. I mean, I went down that path for quite a while, and I had a science degree and a PhD, and had worked as a researcher for a decade or half a decade. So it just takes a while to make that transition to suddenly one day realize, oh, okay, this evolution stuff, it looks pretty convincing. And it was evidence in the field of plant science that really swung it for me. And that was the domestication of maize by Indigenous Americans, which over 10,000 years. And scientists have identified the genes that carried mutations that shifted the ancestor of maize, teosinte, a wild grass in Mexico, which is virtually inedible, into what we have today. About 5 or 6 mutations in different genes, and you go from a weedy grass to an amazing plant that is so productive. So, yeah.
Thomas Murphy's in the house, and Thomas writes, shout out to Thomas. He's an important pioneer in this field. Thomas writes, great summary, Simon Southerton. I would add that the Heartland model is blatantly racist. And Thomas, you may have joined us a little late because we definitely covered that.
And he has Iroquois ancestry, so he's First Nations ancestry.
Yeah.
It's a bit more personal.
Yeah. Shout out to Thomas Murphy, who is a pioneer in all this stuff. Well, Gerardo, any final thoughts or comments you wanted to make? Did Simon's presentation meet or exceed your expectations?
Yes, for sure. This was great. Super detailed. I mean, I think there was no doubt, right, that this was pseudoscience at the beginning, before we started the presentation, but then after we went with detail, I think what's more shocking to me is how people like Rodney Meldrum and this other person, after being corrected by the people that actually did the research, they still won't correct what they're saying, right?
But it's a simple misunderstanding of the science too. Carbonate comes from carbon dioxide. It doesn't come from the Kennewick Man.
Right.
All the carbonate dates are inaccurate and unrelated. It tells you how old the soil is, or where the soil carbonate formed, which is thousands of years after Kennewick Man. Doesn't matter how much they.
But even Rodney Meldrum was corrected by the scientists he had on, like years before the Kennewick Man, right? Like,
yeah.
So it seems to be a pattern. I don't know, just interesting. And thanks, Simon. This was an amazing presentation for sure.
Hey, we have a wonderful comment again from Boyd Tuttle. Boyd says, John, I think your listeners would be better served by letting them hear from the principles that are being ridiculed here, rather than having your guests put their own words into their mouths. So, yeah. So I guess Boyd missed the part where I said that I talked to Rod Meldrum earlier today. I invited him on the show, and admittedly, it was late notice, but he said he had an appointment. But I invited him to watch this show and then come back on the show, and we would love to have him and Simon directly discuss the science.
Well, if they send me through 5 dot points, and I'll address them. But I'm not going to go down a rabbit hole of 25 or 30 different claims, because I'm not getting involved in a gish gallop.
Right.
So Rod Meldrum and or Boyd Tuttle and or anyone else who's paying attention, who has a dog in this fight, email me at mormonstories@gmail.com with 5 rebuttals or responses or questions for Simon, and we'll have Simon back to answer them, and or have you whoever you are and Simon back on Mormon Stories to discuss the science. How's that? Is that all right, Simon?
All
right. Awesome.
I mean, I got to say that my listeners just love, you're a legend. I've told people in every episode we've had with you that reading your book, Losing a Lost Tribe, was instrumental in my faith journey way back when I was living in, Issaquah, Washington, working for Microsoft. And so you're a pioneer, and you got excommunicated for your work, and you've done so much important writing and scholarship, and so you just deserve all the kudos and the affection and the appreciation from us. And that's why I'm just so thrilled that you would come back on Mormon Stories. Blank check. Anytime you want to prepare any presentation, Simon Southerton, we will welcome you back on. I'm so happy to have you on twice in the past few months. And do you have some books or some PDFs or some ebooks that you want to let people know about? Just so
No, not at the moment. I may publish probably a hard copy of something in the next year or so, but I'm not committing to anything yet. But if you want to read a really good book, if you're interested in the true story of Kennewick Man, then the Owsley and Jantz book that Tim Heaton mentioned, that's basically what David Reed's book is about. It's systematic running through of that book, and then a bit on the DNA as well. But that's if you want to read what real scientists do and how thorough they are. I think it's in a pretty readable. It's fairly reasonably technical, but I think it's designed to be read by a reasonably educated audience. So, and you can I think you can purchase it for about $7 or something, $10. Or you could read David Reed's book and pay $23, which is about 60 pages long.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah. And I think Boyd and Rodney and others, I think we deserve a response to Simon's thoughtful presentation here before Simon has the burden of responding to any of your thoughts and comments.
But this won't. It'll have no impact. I'm convinced of that. We've had 15 years of ignoring even an LDS scientist who wrote the church's essay.
Right.
They've ignored him.
Yeah.
Okay? He's ground up bones. He's isolated DNA. He's sequenced it. He's compared it. He's done the whole thing, and he's wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Gerardo, there's a shout out to you. Josh writes, I can't believe you guys are able to get all these great guests on Mormon Stories. I guess we should be thanking Gerardo for getting Simon. Josh says, the smartest thing I've done was to get Gerardo and Kara on Mormon Stories. So before you and Kara, Mormon Stories is pretty worthless. So thank you for making Mormon Stories valuable, Gerardo.
Can I ask, Gerardo, are you do you have Mayan ancestry, or is it another indigenous group?
I honestly I don't know. I've never done a DNA. Like if the family history that my parents and family have done only goes back so far. We just can't tell. But I'm assuming there might be some Mayan, because there's a Mayan last name somewhere.
Yeah, but you're in the where did you grow up?
Yucatan.
Well,
yeah, but my dad is from Mexico City. My dad's from Mexico City, and my mom is from Yucatan.
I'm almost certain you'd have Mayan ancestry, and if you did an ancestry DNA test, they could assign portions of your DNA to a range of indigenous populations.
Yeah,
you should do that.
Maybe we'll find another podcast. Yeah, that would be great. That would be fun. That would be awesome.
Yeah, because that's easy to do. They've got representative populations from all of the indigenous groups down through Mesoamerica. Yeah,
awesome.
Gerardo, you've got a viewer, Doug, who's willing to pay for a DNA test for you. That's very personal.
Yeah. Yeah, send me a link, Simon, because the ones I found, they only tell you if you are Native American or like Central Native American. They don't go back far after that. I don't know.
Okay, I could get in touch with some scientists that have done that sort of analysis, and they might be able to recommend a company. But like I had my DNA done by a company that's got a huge database in Europe and England, because that's where all my ancestors come from, and they gave pretty good analysis. But you would need a company that's got access, and that I don't know how that might be a little bit more complicated than I'm on making it seem,
Yeah.
because you have to have, permission and consent from those groups that the DNA is only going to be used in certain ways. So, yeah, I'd have to, but it's worth looking into.
Well, Doug already donated for it.
Donated $100 for, and I just want to thank.
You got to make sure that goes to Gerardo.
I will, Gerardo. That money's yours. And I do want to thank. We've had 4 or 5 or 6 donors over the past few hours. Click on the little $ button next to the chat in YouTube and do what's called a super chat, which is a donation. We do try and pay Gerardo for his work, and it costs money to run this stuff. So thanks to everyone who donates to the Open Stories Foundation of Mormon Stories, and who donate on the super chat features on YouTube to help make this podcast possible. And Simon, we just adore you. Is there anything we can do to thank you for what you?
Let me go.
Simon, I'm surprised.
I really enjoyed it.
I'm surprised Mormonism still captures your attention at times, but I'm grateful. I don't want it to stop.
I've just got a corral of hobby horses that I like to ride every now and then.
May you never
go and play golf and go cycling.
Never get off those horses, Simon. We need you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, will do.
All right. Thanks, Simon.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Gerardo. You're the best.
Bye.
You guys take care. And thanks to all our listeners who have joined us today on Mormon Stories podcast. If you value this programming and you can't afford to support us financially, that's totally fine. We're very happy to give this away for free for people who want it and need it and can't afford to support it. If you do value this programming and you can afford to support us, we really appreciate your support, because we lose donors every month to financial difficulty, or people just getting bored or moving on. And so we're losing 10 to 20 donors a month. And sometimes people don't like the changes I make. They're like, why are you bringing Gerardo on? Or why are you bringing Kara on? I'm canceling my donations because I don't like Gerardo or I don't like Kara. So we need people to donate to replace the donors that quit when we make a change. So please consider becoming a monthly donor to Mormon Stories Podcast and the Open Stories Foundation. Our foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit in the U.S. We're transparent in our finances. We're tax deductible in the U.S. And all of the money that you donate goes towards supporting the mission of the podcast. So go to mormonstories.org, click on the donate button, become a monthly donor. And we promise to keep doing this content for a long, long time. And we'll stop when your support stops. You can support us by subscribing on YouTube and Facebook and Mormon Stories TikTok, and on Instagram, by sharing this content with others, by spreading it through word of mouth, by giving us a positive review on Apple Podcast. We need those because haters give us bad reviews all the time and they don't even listen to the podcast. And we could use your positive reviews on the Mormon Stories Podcast Facebook page. Thanks for your support. Email us at Mormon Stories. We do have a Patreon page, Mark. We don't really use it much, but yeah, if you want to donate through Patreon, you can do that as well. And and we I didn't mean any disrespect to Rod Meldrum or to Brother Tuttle or any of these other people. I just think this idea of having non-scientists contradict the entire global scientific community in religiously motivated ways is kind of absurd. And I think my sarcasm maybe spills over a little bit from time to time. So I apologize for that. We mean no disrespect, but we don't believe it's ethical to make money off of misleading people scientifically. And so we would ask Rod Meldrum, Mr. Tuttle, and anyone else who we've referenced today, or anyone else who is a part of this Heartland theory business, to please be responsible in the things you teach people, because the more you perpetuate pseudoscience at the expense of validating and supporting science, you're perpetuating non-scientific conspiracy theory worldviews that spill over and threaten, frankly, the foundations of our democracy on this earth and in this country. So please stop. And yeah, Rod Meldrum, we welcome you to come on Mormon Stories and respond to this. And we welcome any of the pseudoscientists or publishers who were mentioned in this presentation to come on Mormon Stories. We'll bring Simon on, and we'll allow there to be a robust scientific discussion. Sans Gish Gallop. So thanks, everybody. Thanks for your support. Please continue supporting us. We love you guys. Be good to each other. Be kind to each other. Value science. And we'll see you guys all again very soon on another episode of Mormon Stories podcast. Take care, everybody.